Chapter 689. At noon, Scholar He placed a hand on his forehead to block the blinding sun. Ignoring the blinding sweat flowing down his face, he quickly left the quiet royal palace. He did not enter the small corner room of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Instead, he boarded the sedan chair and came to the yamen of the Imperial Censorate. Once he entered the yamen, he realized that his official robes had long been soaked in sweat. Dazed, he walked woodenly into the hall and sat alone for a long time before he came to his senses. Previously, His Majesty had summoned him to the Imperial study. With just a few simple words, He Zongwei knew that the secret plan he had set up had all fallen into His Majesty's eyes. His Majesty knew what he was investigating, but was too lazy to ask, too lazy to care, and only looked at him coldly. Thinking of this, Scholar He's entire body trembled with fear. After all, his investigation had been somewhat improper. Given the Emperor's intelligent eyes, since he already knew of this matter, how could he not see it? What surprised him was that the Emperor did not harshly reprimand him. He only tiredly gave a few instructions before chasing him out. He Zongwei sank into deep thought in the cool Imperial Censorate Yamen. Why was the Emperor not angry? Had the Internal Court and Ministry of Justice actually found something in Dazhou? Was it that Tiger Guard Gao Da or Wang Qinian, who was definitely not dead, who had given himself away? Dazhou was not far from Jingdou, but it took time to send information back and forth. He Zongwei had no other way. He could only wait excitedly and nervously in Jingdou for the report. Until now, he still did not know that his search for Gao Da in Dazhou was in line with the will of heaven. It would block the returning Director Qin outside the city. At the same time, it would give Qin Pingping an opportunity to act. This was also the Emperor's opportunity to act. Not only did He Zongwei not know the inside story of what was happening in Dazhou, who the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and the Qing officials of the 6 ministries and 3 temples also did not guess that the Qing kingdom was in a state of turmoil. They only smelled something strange. No one connected this smell to the retired Director Qin. Even the most intelligent person would not think that problems would occur between the Emperor and Qin Pingping. Furthermore, the officials did not even think in this direction. Even the officials of the Overwatch Council had never doubted the old ancestors' loyalty to the Qing kingdom and the Emperor. Be loyal to the Emperor and do everything for the Qing kingdom. This was the education all the officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council had received when they first entered the academy. During these decades, with Qin Pingping at the head, all of the black-clothed officials had worked endlessly for this goal, for the strength of the Qing kingdom and for the Emperor's safety. Who would have thought that the Overwatch Council would become one of the Emperor's targets? It was precisely because no one had thought of this that there were people who were sensitive enough to probe in that direction. As the most powerful intelligence network and secret service organization in the world, many signs of the strange activity in Jingdou had fallen into the eyes of the officials of the Overwatch Council. In particular, the increase in the level of defense of the Imperial Army, the sudden movement of the Jingdou garrison, and even Scholar He's sudden entry into the palace and dejectedly leaving the palace had all fallen into different eyes. Through different channels they were all sent back to the square, black-gray building. Other than the 5th Bureau, where the Black Knights were, all of the leading figures of the 8 bureaus were in the black-gray building of the Overwatch Council. The sun had just moved to the west when the intelligence reports had been gathered to the 2nd Bureau. After being sorted out by different intelligence officials, they were then placed on the desk of the head of the 2nd Bureau. The head of the 2nd Bureau was a middle-aged man. He was one of the few old officials of the 8 bureaus who had stayed behind. Ever since Fan Xian became the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and gradually began to take over the power of the Overwatch Council, in order to make his takeover smoother, Qin Pingping began to persuade the old officials of the 8 bureaus to leave. These old officials had single-handedly built this council with Director Qin, so they did not have any conflict with the son of the young lady of the Yi family. Thus they left naturally and happily. Mu Tai took over the 1st Bureau. Fan Xian's brother disciple who used poison, took over the 3rd Bureau. Yan Bingyun took over the 4th Bureau. The commander of the Black Knights had become the silver-masked Jinggu. The bald head of the 7th Bureau had left a long time ago. The head of the 8th Bureau was someone Fan Xian had picked from the Qinian unit. Only the 2nd Bureau, because of the importance of intelligence reports, was still managed by the old head. He sincerely and dutifully trained his deputy. Once the deputy was able to take over the entire Qing kingdom's intelligence system, he would have this person close to Director Fan take over. The Overwatch Council and Imperial Censorate had been fighting lawsuits. Director Fan Jr. did not like Scholar He, so He Zongwei had always been the focus of the Overwatch Council's secret surveillance. Although the emperor had always been opposed to this kind of surveillance, the court could not keep an eye on the Overwatch Council using the power in their hands to do other things. The middle-aged head of the Second Bureau furrowed his brows as he looked at the file in his hand. He didn't know what the emperor had said to Hizongwei for his expression to become so ugly. As for the changes in the Imperial Army and the departure of the Jingdo garrison, they were also sensitive intelligence reports. The head of the Second Bureau furrowed his brows and thought for a long time. He still could not understand what power there was around Jingdo that the court needed to deal with so carefully. In particular, the Overwatch Council had not participated in this matter from the beginning. The palace had not even given a word. This was truly very different from before. He picked up the file on the table and coughed. He walked out the door and up the stairs to the quiet secret room. He knocked on the door twice and pushed it open to enter. A young official dressed in white, completely at odds with the sinister atmosphere of the Overwatch Council, was sitting behind the large table and looking intently at something. The head of the Second Bureau smiled slightly. He looked at Yan Bingyun and sighed in his heart. He then walked forward and placed the file in his hands on the table. The old director had already retired. Sir Fan Jr. had finally become the true director. It was clear that Sir Yen Jr. would not only manage the affairs of the Fourth Bureau. He would probably take over Fan Xian's position as the new commissioner of the Overwatch Council. During these years, Qin Pingping had been recuperating. Fan Xian also did not have the patience to manage the details. Thus, all of the Overwatch Council's affairs had always been shouldered by Yan Bingyun alone. Thus, when Yan Bingyun became the commissioner in charge of the council's miscellaneous matters, the officials of the Overwatch Council were all used to it and would not have any objections. For the old officials of the Overwatch Council, although Sir Fan Jr. was a startling talent and because of the young lady of the Yi family and Director Chen's relationship, they were all loyal to Fan Xian and had great respect for him. However, there was always a distance to this respect. In comparison, Sir Yen Jr., who had grown up in the Overwatch Council and paid a great price for the council in northern Qi, was, without question, closer. Uncle Lu, what is it that requires you to personally deliver it? Yan Bingyun smiled warmly, completely without the frosty feeling he had in front of Fan Xian. Standing, he invited the head of the Second Bureau to sit. He then casually flipped open the files. The movements of the Imperial Army and Jingdo garrison only need to be reported to the Internal Court and Bureau of Military Affairs. It doesn't matter if we don't know about it. The head of the Second Bureau looked at Yan Bingyun worriedly. But this does not conform to convention. Such a major matter, there must be a purpose. However, the Overwatch Council still does not know what has happened. Yan Bingyun had already flipped through the intelligence reports. The curve of his lips remained steady. Smiling slightly, he said, "It has not been peaceful in Dongyi recently. There are many aces in those places. Furthermore, the Jianghu people are murderous. Perhaps the palace is worried that, like the Hanging Temple that year, a few more killers have snuck in. It is not a big deal for the Imperial Army to raise the level of defense. It is the Jingdo garrison." Yan Bingyun shook his head. In a moment, send a message to the Bureau of Military Affairs to ask. The Bureau of Military Affairs can ignore us. The head of the Second Bureau furrowed his brows and said. Furthermore, the problem now is that Shi Fei personally led the troops away. It must have been an edict from the palace. He suddenly thought of something. He remembered that Director Chen's carriages had not left Jingdo for long. Immediately, he smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. What is it? Yan Bingyun's gaze was deep as he glanced at him unintentionally. Nothing. The head of the Second Bureau shook his head and smiled. I'm really getting old. Sometimes it's easy for my mind to run wild. He would never have thought that the palace would act against the old director he respected the most. Thus, he unconsciously put an end to his earlier speculations. Just like Gong Dian and Yi Zhong's confusion and General Shi Fei's unease and fear, no one could have thought of this. Yan Bingyun slowly lowered his head and said, the council's surveillance of the military has never been a public matter. It is best not to send a message to the Bureau of Military Affairs. What is the usual method? We cannot interfere with the military. Usually, we draft up an intelligence report and send it to the palace for the emperor to look over. The head of the Second Bureau was silent for a moment and then said, of course, we have to react faster to unusual movements like today. All right. Yan Bingyun's head remained lowered. Immediately put this intelligence report into a report and send it through the secret tunnel to the royal study. Yes. The head of the Second Bureau unconsciously acknowledged like a subordinate. He suddenly felt that Yan Bingyun's reaction was strange. He did not raise his head and appeared rude. He was now an official of the same rank as him. He had not truly taken up the position of commissioner, yet. He shook his head again. He had watched Yan Bingyun grow up and knew he was not like this. He just thought there was something wrong with the Yan manner, so he didn't think more about it. Picking up the file, he left. The opportunity for the Overwatch Council to react at the first instant was lost just like that. In front of the Qing Kingdom's powerful state apparatus, if the Overwatch Council as a secret agency did not have any reaction, it might be the best reaction for this country, this court, or even this square black and gray building. The room returned to its unchanging silence for countless years. Yan Bingyun slowly raised his head. If there was someone beside him, they would certainly see the increasing struggle and pain in Sir Yan Jr.'s eyes. Yan Bingyun's hands were clenched tightly under the table and did not loosen for a long time. His thin lips were pressed together tightly, so tightly that there was almost no blood left. He slowly stood up and walked to the side of the window. Lifting the black curtain, he gazed out. With a glance, he saw a corner of the bright yellow royal palace glistening under the clear autumn sunlight. He thought of the first time he entered the Overwatch Council. The old man in the wheelchair had met him in this room. The black cloth on the window seemed to have never been taken down. It was as if the old man was used to the darkness and never saw the sunlight again. Later, the old man left this room and returned to Qin Garden. Fan Xian did not like staying in the Overwatch Council's serious and sinister courtyard every day, so the person who stayed in this room the longest was Yan Bingyun himself. In the past, the heads of the 8 bureaus would report matters to the 2 sides of this long table. Now there was no one on either side of the long table. In the past, there would always be a wheelchair at the end of the long table. Behind the wheelchair was a patch of shadow. Now the wheelchair was long gone. Yan Bingyun slowly pulled down the black curtain in his hand and let out a long sigh. The confusion, struggle, and pain in his eyes gradually disappeared. Since he was the second owner of this room, he had to inherit the previous owner's temperament and will. Since he had made up his mind, he could not hesitate. Yan Bingyun was one of the 7 young officials the Qing Emperor had summoned into the palace when he was injecting new blood into the court. These 7 young officials were the new people the Qing Emperor had prepared for the future of the Qing Kingdom. Other than Qin Heng, who had died in the rebellion, the other 6 had already begun to shine in the Qing court. Of the 6, the one who had climbed the fastest was He Zhongwei. At such a young age, he was already a traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He also held the position of Imperial Censor of the Left. Yan Bingyun and Qing Jialin, one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, were, without question, grouped into Fan Xian's faction. However, no one knew how much effort and intimidation the Qing Kingdom's mighty emperor had put into the Overwatch Council Sir Yan Jr. during that night's conversation. In the emperor's eyes, the most important of the so-called 7 gentlemen were He Zhongwei and Yan Bingyun. Yan Bingyun slowly sat down and spread his palms flat on the table. Gently, he ran his hands over the Overwatch Council's complicated documents and intelligence reports. Then, he gently rang a bell and summoned in his direct subordinates, as well as the members of the Qinian unit he could use. In a quiet voice he gave out order after order. These orders did not appear to have any connection to each other and did not draw much attention. However, the reinforcement to Dongyi and the exchange with Deng Ziyu in Shiliang Road would take up most of the Overwatch Council's attention during these dozen days. In total, 4 orders easily emptied most of the Jingdo Overwatch Council's power and began to move them to various places in the Qing Kingdom. These movements were not unusual, so they did not draw anyone's attention. However, with this, it would be difficult for the Overwatch Council to gather a powerful killing force in Jingdo again. There were not many people who could do this. Even if Fan Xian did it himself, he probably would not have done it as quickly as Yan Bingyun. In the end, Fan Xian was not someone who could handle detailed matters. He understood the Overwatch Council very well, but he still did not understand it as thoroughly as Yan Bingyun. For such a large Overwatch Council to be able to create such a result by only moving a few points, Sir Yan Jr.'s planning skills were still as powerful as ever. The only thing that could not be moved was the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council. The First Bureau was responsible for overseeing the governance of Jingdo's officials. Furthermore, the First Bureau had been personally managed by Fan Xian. Although Mu Tai had become the head of the First Bureau, the officials of the First Bureau still felt that their direct superior was the director. Although Yan Bingyun had Fan Xian's orders, he could not use overly bizarre orders to move them out of Jingdo. After Yan Bingyun finished all of this, he took a deep breath. It was as if everything he had just done had almost suffocated him. Everything is for the Qing Kingdom. Yan Bingyun slowly closed his eyes. He couldn't help but think of the conversation he had with his father a long time ago. The corners of his smooth eyes twitched involuntarily. Or is it all for the Overwatch Council? When Eunuch Yao left the royal study and came to the foot of the palace walls to announce the imperial edict to Yi Zhong and Gong Dian, not many people in the royal palace knew of this matter. When Yi Zhong and Gong Dian knelt on the ground and forcefully suppressed the shock and unease in their hearts to receive the edict, Eunuch Yao handed over the emperor's letter and said expressionlessly, "General Shifei is waiting for the edict." Yi Zhong stood up and accepted the emperor's letter. It was as if he had accepted Dong Mountain. It was so heavy that he could barely raise his arm. He was one of the few remaining 9th-level aces in the Qing kingdom. Faced with this letter, he still felt that he could not bear the burden. Fortunately, the person who truly needed this letter was Shifei, an important official sent by the military from Yanjing. Because he had not been in Jingdo for a long time, he had been sent by the emperor on such a dangerous mission. As the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong couldn't help but feel a wave of sorrow for Shifei. At the same time, a chill rose in his heart. The emperor had sent the military from Yanjing to handle this matter and not the Dingzhou army. Other than the fact that Shifei was leading the Jingdo garrison, it had to be said that Yi Zhong had lived in Jingdo for a long time. The emperor was not at ease with his relationship with Chen Pingping. Yi Zhong understood this, but his expression did not change at all. Eunuch Yao left the imperial army camp empty-handed. With his body hunched, he slowly walked deeper into the palace. Like Yi Zhong, many complicated emotions rose and fell in this head eunuch's heart. After serving in the palace for a long time, he was used to the conversation between the emperor and old director Chen that was completely different from that between ruler and official. He knew that in the emperor's heart, old director Chen was not just a normal official. Thinking of the emperor's angry scene in the royal study, the smile on Eunuch Yao's face involuntarily became bitter. In his opinion, if the emperor truly wanted to punish old director Chen, then wouldn't it have been more convenient for the emperor to take action in Jingdo when the old director had entered the palace to bid farewell? Why did he have to wait until old director Chen had already left the capital and was on his way home before taking action? The matter was in Dazhou. The Tiger Guard who had escaped before the battle was in Dazhou. The Ministry of Justice aces that scholar he had sent were in Dazhou. The aces that the internal court had sent to help the imperial censorate were also in Dazhou. Eunuch Yao understood the emperor's intentions better than anyone. It looked like the emperor was still watching. Eunuch Yao knew that if old director Qin truly wanted to escape, unless the emperor personally led troops to chase after him, no one would be able to stop that strange old creature. He walked to Taiji Palace and leaned against the side of a pillar, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The eunuchs and serving girls who passed him bowed respectfully and slightly fearfully and then silently left. Eunuch Yao closed his eyes and enjoyed the early autumn afternoon sunlight. He sighed to himself and said to himself, "Old director, since you've left, don't come back. The emperor also doesn't want you to come back." After the cold-blooded and heartless Qing emperor had secretly investigated for a long time, he still went against his nature and gave Qin Pingping a chance to defend himself and a chance to leave. Before Qin Pingping left, he did not defend himself. Now, outside Dazhou, he had run into Tiger Guard Gouda, who was wanted by the court. It all depended on whether or not he was willing to leave. If Qin Pingping was willing to leave, perhaps this matter would be over. If he was not willing to leave, then he would have to return to Jingdo. This was not the Qing emperor's affection for Qin Pingping. It was probably more of an interrogation, questioning, and quiet questioning of Qin Pingping's heart. The Qing emperor and Qin Pingping had known and accompanied each other for decades. He could accept anyone betraying him because a paranoid emperor never trusted anyone in the world. However, he could not accept Qin Pingping betraying him. He didn't even believe any of the truths he had discovered. When a person lived in this world, they were always afraid of being alone, particularly the person sitting on the throne. Perhaps the Qing emperor himself did not realize that Qin Pingping, this seemingly lonely old cripple, was the only source of warmth in his cold heart that could prove he was a living person. Thus the emperor was angry and worried. Until the end, he still looked at himself and Qin Pingping's heart with a glimmer of uncertainty. Those closely involved could not see clearly. Perhaps the only person who could see all of this clearly was the head eunuch leaning against a pillar in Taiji Palace and basking in the sun. Eunuch Hong liked to bask in the sun. Eunuch Yao also liked to bask in the sun. Eunuch Ho, who had died to Fan Xian's hand, also liked to bask in the sun. It was probably because these abnormal people hid too many secrets in their hearts. Their eyes were more sinister than anyone else's, allowing them to know too much about the emperor's joys, anger, sorrow, and joy. However, they could not say it or think about it. Thus, they could only allow the sun to shine endlessly on their bodies to prevent the secrets in their bodies from becoming moldy and the icy emotions from frostbite them. Eunuch Yao closed his eyes and slowly breathed. He was not a powerful warrior like Hong Xiang. He also did not have the noble spirit to sacrifice himself for the Qin kingdom's unification of the world. He was just a cautious and careful person. All of his goals were to ensure that he could live on safely. Thus, other than fear, he had no other thoughts regarding the matter between the emperor and old Director Qin. "The sun is truly quite good today," Eunuch Dai said with a smile as he walked out from the side of the hall and leaned against him. Eunuch Yao smiled and glanced at his old companion. The two of them had entered the palace together. However, Eunuch Dai's days in the palace had not been as peaceful as his. Eunuch Dai had first been in Lady Shu's palace and had been deeply favored by the emperor. The important matters of passing edicts to officials' manners were all given to him to do. Later he lost power in one day and did miserably in the palace. It was not until Sir Fan Jr.'s help and his outstanding performance during the palace rebellion that he once again made a name for himself in the palace. All of the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace were afraid of Eunuch Yao. After all, he was the head eunuch closest to the emperor. However, Eunuch Dai did not have the fear that most people had. After all, he was an old acquaintance. Furthermore, Eunuch Dai's power was not small. Behind him was Sir Fan Jr. Eunuch Yao did not reply. He only moved to the side and gave him half of the corridor pillar's position. Eunuch Dai glanced at him. He wanted to say something but then stopped. Instead, he sighed and said, "When we first entered the palace, we were lazy and sunbathing here. In the end, we were beaten 50 times by Eunuch Hong. Do you still remember?" Of course, Eunuch Yao remembered. Among the young eunuchs at the time, the young marquis had already died. He sighed. He knew what old Dai wanted to ask. Presumably, he had also sensed the strangeness in the royal palace today. However, this matter was too big. In the entire world, probably only 5 people knew about it. Furthermore, Eunuch Dai and Sir Fan Jr. had a good relationship, so this matter had to be hidden from him. Eunuch Yao smiled and narrowed his eyes as he glanced at the sun to his left. Of the companions of the past, in the end, some died and some scattered. How many of them are like you and I who still remember the friendship of being beaten together? We are still alive. As long as we are alive, that is good. Eunuch Dai shook his head. Eunuch Yao suddenly raised his head and gazed toward the end of the long corridor. He saw a young eunuch slowly walking over with his back hunched. He narrowed his eyes and said, "Hong Zhu has been following you recently. How is he?" "This child probably suffered a great shock 3 years ago. He's become more and more taciturn." Eunuch Dai clearly liked the clever and taciturn young eunuch. He sighed and said, "Back then he was also a popular person in the Eastern Palace. Who would have thought that he would end up like this? Back then he also served in the royal study. Being taciturn is also a good thing," Eunuch Yao said calmly. "Back then you also talked too much." Eunuch Dai smiled self-mockingly and didn't say anything more. 2 days later, in a mountain on the outskirts of Dazhou, the Jingdou garrison, which had just rested for less than a day, received an urgent secret report from the Bureau of Military Affairs in Jingdou. Shi Fei accepted the secret letter and destroyed the wax at the mouth of the letter. He read the contents of the letter word by word. His pupils constricted slightly and then returned to normal. He was not silent for long before he handed the letter to the soldier beside him. "Take this letter well. You are not allowed to show yourself tomorrow. If I die, give this letter to Sir Fan Jr." Thousands of Jingdou garrison riders were waiting in the valley. General Shi Fei only brought the soldiers beside him to stand under the setting sun and watch the activity in Dazhou not far ahead. The soldier was slightly shocked. He thought that the Yanjing army had never had any connection to Sir Fan Jr. or even the Overwatch Council. Why was this letter so important? Shi Fei laughed coldly and didn't explain anything. He looked at his subordinates at the bottom of the valley. He had no confidence in his heart. Even he didn't know whether or not there were spies planted by the Overwatch Council among the Jingdou garrison soldiers. Although the court had clearly decreed that the Overwatch Council's regulations strictly forbade the Overwatch Council from infiltrating the military, what kind of person was General Shi Fei? He did not believe this at all. Even a major figure like the old Qin master had fallen to the hands of an Overwatch Council spy. Shi Fei did not think he was more powerful than Qin Yi. He took a deep breath and said, "Slow down and move closer in the direction of Dazhou." He was afraid that he would fail and die. He was even more afraid that once he died, the emperor, in order to appease Sir Fan Jr.'s emotions, would put the crime of killing Director Qin on him. Thus, he handed the emperor's letter to his soldier. If he failed this time, then this letter had to be delivered to Fan Xian's hands. Chapter 690. Dazhou in the night, surrounded by torches and filled with sparks in the sky and on the ground. Dazhou was not much darker than day. The previous director of the Overwatch Council, the Qing Emperor's most loyal servant and closest official, Qin Pingping, sat in his wheelchair. He looked at the people kneeling on the ground and kowtowing to him on both sides of the road. The expression on his face did not tremble at all. The fine and deep wrinkles did not bloom into the shape of a chrysanthemum. Instead, they coldly spread out. It was like a shocking scene formed on a yellow plain after being washed by rain for thousands of years. His withered and old hands slowly stroked across the wool blanket. This light gray wool blanket was always smooth and comfortable. Each time he stroked it, Qin Pingping always felt that he was stroking something he did not have the good fortune to touch. It did not take long for him to learn from the internal court eunuch what had happened in Dazhou. He also learned who the court criminal being protected by the Overwatch Council subordinates and being treated was. Gouda? Qin Pingping was not familiar with this name, but he was not a stranger either. He knew that it was Fan Xian's trusted bodyguard. He glanced at the blood-covered criminal of the imperial court, and his cold eyes gradually narrowed. The Overwatch Council did not know that Gouda was still alive. Qin Pingping sighed in his heart. He thought to himself that even the leader of the Tiger Guards had been turned by Fan Xian into someone who valued his life. Although Enji usually appeared indifferent and uninteresting in his conduct, unexpectedly, he had such magic in the fine details. Just as Qin Pingping had said to himself earlier, Qiao Qiao's mother had actually given birth to Qiao Qiao. This was not a very coincidental matter. Rather, it was preordained by cause and effect. The events of the past were preordained, and then they landed here. Just like how the convoy of 30 black carriages of the Overwatch Council was passing through Dazhou as normal. Outside Dazhou, they ran into the court's entourage searching for an imperial criminal. The criminal the court was searching for was one of Fan Xian's people. This was not a coincidence, nor was it a chance encounter. Perhaps there was something hidden behind all of this. Sir, he was actually able to find an escaped imperial criminal. How impressive, Qin Pingping said with a slight smile. Qin Pingping coughed twice and said with a smile. Behind him, the old servant who never left his side pushed his wheelchair towards the center of the crowd. As the wheelchair rolled on the official road, it made a heart-palpitating sound. The internal court eunuch He Qigan had a very high status in the palace. However, his personality was sinister and he had never been liked by the nobles in the palace. So his status was not very important. However, having suffered in the imperial palace for decades, he naturally knew what kind of attitude he should display at this time. He led the 2 eunuchs and the aces from the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens to disperse the encirclement. He was afraid that Director Chen would think that they were hostile. Ichigan knew what kind of terrifying figure old Director Chen was. He had never hoped that since they had met Director Chen today, if he gave the order, they would still be able to take the imperial court criminal away. Of course, from another perspective, he did not think that the old director, who had already retired, would go against the emperor's decree for such an insignificant court criminal. After all, the old director was the emperor's most loyal subordinate. However, he had overlooked 2 things. First, Qin Pingping knew that Gouda was Fan Xian's person. Fan Xian never liked other people coming to deal with his people, even if those so-called other people were people sent by the palace. Second, Qin Pingping was immersed in a complicated emotion. He looked at the unconscious court criminal Gouda on the ground and thought about things that bystanders could not understand. The Overwatch Council's treatment was very effective. Gouda finally slowly woke up from the pool of blood. He should not have been able to withstand such heavy injuries. However, in order to protect his wife and child, a few knife wounds had cut deep into his flesh. All of them had been forcefully received by his body and arms. As soon as he woke up, his eyes were pierced by the torches around him. Gouda's dry lips moved slightly. He then saw the black wheelchair close to him as well as the important figure in it. He hadn't seen old Director Chen many times, but he knew what kind of person he was, especially after seeing old Director Chen's slightly worried and complicated gaze. The mute woman saw that her husband had woken up and was overjoyed. Holding the child, she half knelt by his side and repeatedly nodded her thanks to the Overwatch Council officials around her. This commoner woman did not know how delicate the current situation was. She also did not know that whether or not to save him was actually just a prelude to the major events to come. It all depended on what Qin Pingping did. Gouda's expression darkened. He knew that if Qin Pingping kept his life for Sir Fan Jr.'s sake, Then He Zongwei could use this matter to drag Fan Xian and even Qin Pingping down with him. His finger moved slightly. A ruthless light flashed through his eyes. He bent his finger and tapped it against his temple. He wanted to escape earlier because he was alone with his wife and child. Even when faced with the powerful machinery of the Qin kingdom, he still wanted to stubbornly live on until the day he could no longer live on. However, he wanted to commit suicide now because he knew that if he lived, he would give Qin Pingping, or more accurately Sir Fan Jr., who Qin Pingping wanted to protect, a difficult problem. Thus he chose to commit suicide. Qin Pingping watched him take action and did not have any reaction. There was only a glimmer of admiration flashing through his eyes, as well as a knowing smile flashing across his face. With a slap, the Overwatch Council official who had been standing guard by Gao Da's side the entire time easily stopped Gao Da's thought of committing suicide. He gazed at Gao Da and coldly said, "It's not easy to live for another 3 years. You already have a wife and child. Why are you in such a hurry to die?" This voice was very familiar. Gao Da's heart jumped slightly. With great difficulty he turned his head to look. He did not expect to see a completely unfamiliar face. However, the Overwatch Council official returned to his original tone of voice. Adding to the familiar teasing light in his eyes, Gao Da immediately knew the other party's identity. Gao Da's dry lips moved slightly but he could not speak. He looked at the Overwatch Council official like he was looking at a ghost. After a long time he said in a low voice, crying and laughing, "So, you are also alive." The Overwatch Council official smiled slightly and tightened the strips of cloth on his body. Patting his hand he said, "Who doesn't want to live? With the director here, your life and death is not up to you to decide." Qin Pingping leaned tiredly against the black wheelchair. The Qin garden women on both sides of the carriages had dispersed into the woods to relieve themselves. Fortunately, the shameful voices did not come over. However, the teasing voices gradually grew louder. The old man narrowed his eyes and looked at Gao Da. "You are not Gao Da." Gao Da's heart jumped. He looked at Director Qin with confusion. Qin Pingping slowly said, "You are only a minor figure. Your life and death is not a major matter, so it is best if you are alive." After these words were said, not only Gao Da and the Overwatch Council official beside him, but even the Ministry of Justice aces scattered around, as well as He Qigan and the other 3 internal court eunuchs, sensed something strange. Tiger Guard Gao Da, who had escaped in the face of battle, was a court criminal that scholar he had been secretly searching for a long time. In the eyes of the Overwatch Council, or more accurately in Qin Pingping's eyes, he was just an unremarkable minor figure. Ichigan silently took 2 steps back. The Dajo Jizhou nervously moved over with small steps and bowed solemnly to Qin Pingping. He then invited the old director into the city to rest. The Overwatch Council was a secret service organization. It was the organization that all officials feared and hated the most. It was also the organization they wanted to establish a relationship with the most. From Qin Pingping to Fan Xian, these 2 people were powerful people who did not need to build relationships in court. Thus, the civil officials of the Qin kingdom never found any opportunities. Without question, this was a great opportunity for the Dajo Jizhou to curry favor with old Director Qin and continue to curry favor with the Duke. As an official, he did not want to pass up this opportunity no matter what. As for the court criminal, that was the business of the internal court and Ministry of Justice officials. It had nothing to do with him. Qin Pingping paid no attention to this official. He only looked coldly at Gao Da, thinking about his own matters. Just as he said earlier, Qin Pingping did not think that Gao Da's sudden appearance was a coincidence. He Zongwei's secret investigation of Gao Da and Wang Qinian could perhaps be hidden from the Overwatch Council, but it could not be hidden from the Emperor. Why did the Emperor choose to have this matter explode on his way back? It was for a reason, an excuse, and an inquiry. The Emperor was far away in Jingdo, separated by thousands of li, and was questioning Qin Pingping. He was using the matter of the court criminal's life to question Qin Pingping. Were you my black dog or a powerful official with your own will? Powerful officials never had good endings. Even someone like Lin Ruofu, who had seen the opportunity and retreated cleanly and completely hid in Wuzhou to be a farmer, still had to be afraid at all times that the Emperor would be unhappy one day. Qin Pingping was not a normal official. He did not need to worry about these things. He knew the Emperor only wanted to ask him a question and then see his attitude toward the Emperor. Qin Pingping suddenly smiled. His smile was slightly strange. Under the blowing of the night wind and the illumination of the torches, it was like the endlessly blooming golden chrysanthemums under the hanging temple, unafraid of the cold wind and ignoring the mundane world as they bloomed in full bloom. "Let Gao Da recover," he said with a slight smile as he gently stroked the arms of the wheelchair. The dozens of people the court had sent from Jingdo to capture the criminal, as well as the hundreds of bailiffs and soldiers from Dazhou, heard these light words and felt a chill in their hearts at the same time. They knew Director Chen had decided to interfere. Although they did not dare to resist and were powerless to resist the Overwatch Council swordsmen and secret agents in the 30 black carriages, as well as the power hidden in the darkness, they still felt shocked. If Chen Pingping wanted to protect this person, the emperor would probably have to give him this face. Ichigan and the aces of the 13 yamens all thought this. Their expressions were very ugly and awkward. However, not a single person dared to express any opposition to Chen Pingping's words. Opposition was ineffective. Opposition was useless. Ichigan's throat was dry. He was not satisfied. He had been sent by the internal court to Scholar He's side and wandered through Qing Kingdom's Chaojun for a year. He was about to capture Gouda, but in an instant Ichigan thought helplessly that even if he failed this mission, after he returned to the capital, as long as he told the main official and the head eunuch that it was Director Chen who had interfered, what did it have to do with him? The sweet and witty Qin garden beauties finally returned. They opened their eyes wide and looked curiously at the people surrounded by torches. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know what their master was saying or thinking, but they were not worried. Regardless of whether it was in Qin Garden, during the guerrilla warfare during the Jingdo Rebellion or now on the road back home, they always had people from the Overwatch Council at their side to protect them. Regardless of which department the officials were, they were all very polite to them. They were all orphan girls Chen Pingping had bought from poor people. Other than being beautiful and able to sing good songs, they had no other strengths. However, Chen Pingping was willing to raise them and protect them. This kind of eccentricity also created these flowers in a greenhouse. If Chen Pingping, this large mountain, fell, no one knew what kind of fate these flowers in a greenhouse would meet. Chen Pingping lowered his head and listened to the familiar women's voices not far behind him. He smiled slightly. He did not have the group of carriages follow the Dazhou Jizhou's invitation into the city to spend the night. Instead, he sat calmly in his wheelchair and looked at the complicated expressions of the internal court eunuchs and Ministry of Justice officials around him. It was as if he was thinking about something and waiting for something. Then he closed his eyes. There were not many people in this world who understood the Qing Emperor as well as Chen Pingping did. Gouda was indeed a minor figure. Even as a touchstone he did not have that kind of hardness. However, the human heart was always a subjective thing. It was as if the Emperor was saying to Chen Pingping in the dark mountains, "This criminal is the stone I left for you." There were many choices placed in front of Chen Pingping. He could save Gouda and then leisurely return home. Although he knew that some people would immediately come before him, just as Yi Zhong and Eunuch Yao thought in the mountains of the Qing Kingdom, who could stop Chen Pingping? He could ignore Gouda's life and death and take the women in the carriages back home to retire and live out the rest of his life. The Emperor gave Chen Pingping one last chance to choose. Regardless of which one Chen Pingping chose, perhaps it was something the Emperor wanted to see. The Emperor knew that if Chen Pingping did not want to return to Jingdo to face him again, then no one could force him to return to Jingdo to face him. Chen Pingping did not move. The atmosphere on the two sides of the road became more and more strange. Many people could already see that Chen Pingping seemed to be waiting for something. Was someone else coming? The Overwatch Council official who had been standing guard by Gao Da's side walked to the side of the wheelchair and lowered his body to quietly say something by Chen Pingping's ear. Chen Pingping slowly shook his head. He shook his head slowly but firmly. Before long, voices gradually rang out from the back of the road. These voices were not very noisy. On the contrary, they carried a cautious tone. The Overwatch Council officials did not stop this group. Instead, they cautiously used their gazes to escort them to the center of the circle of torches. The Dazhou Jizhou, Ichigan, and the other internal court eunuchs and officials of the Ministry of Justice finally saw this group clearly. They finally knew who Director Chen was waiting for. Other than shock, they couldn't help but feel a chill. Director Chen had long known what was going to happen. If this was a large chessboard, then Ichigan, the internal court eunuchs, the officials of the Ministry of Justice who had worked hard for a long time, and even He Zongwei who had laid out this plan in the beginning, were all unremarkable chess pieces on the chessboard. The people He Zongwei had sent did not have an imperial edict in their hands. The Overwatch Council's interference could not be considered disobeying the edict. Given Chen Pingping's position, there was no problem. However, the imperial edict had finally arrived. It was like a red team suddenly jumping a horse onto the back of an elephant and then asking the old black general, "Do you want to move or kill the horse?" There were no eunuchs announcing the edict in the small group of a dozen or so people. These Qing soldiers wore armor and were unusually valiant. However, they all wore complicated emotions on their faces. The leader of the small group held the bright yellow imperial edict high in his hand. The sound of horse hooves broke the silence outside Dajo. All of the soldiers dismounted in unison and bowed solemnly toward Qin Pingping in the wheelchair. The leader of the small group holding the imperial edict began to read the emperor's edict in a trembling voice. The edict had nothing to do with Qin Pingping, who had returned to his hometown to retire. It was only directed at the court criminal Gao Da in the Overwatch Council carriage. It ordered the Ministry of Justice to immediately bring this traitor who deceived the emperor back to the capital. No one was to stop him. Otherwise he would be punished with treason. After the reading of the edict, it was so quiet that one could hear the sound of water dripping from the grass not far away. Everyone's gaze turned fearfully toward the old man in the wheelchair. Even the stupidest person could see that something was wrong. How could there be such a coincidence in the world? Just now, the Overwatch Council had said that the internal court did not have an imperial edict. Now the imperial edict had appeared in Dajo. The Dajo Jijo unconsciously took a step back. Everyone unconsciously took a step back. They finally knew that this scene was actually a game between the emperor and Director Qin. They did not have the right to participate in this matter. They didn't even have the right to take a look. The leader finished reading the imperial edict in a trembling voice and put the bright yellow cloth back into his clothes. He then walked to the front of the wheelchair and knelt down on one knee. In a low voice he said, "I am the Deputy General of the Jingdo Garrison, Guan Xiong. Following General Shi's orders, I have come to assist the Ministry of Justice of the Internal Court in capturing the court criminal. Please make things easier for me, old director." Qin Pingping's face was slightly pale. He knew that this scene would eventually come. In the end, the emperor had not completely blocked off the final path. However, perhaps that was because the emperor had long known that he would block off this path himself. It was still the same old saying. This matter had arisen because of Gao Da, but it had nothing to do with him. It was just a mutual question between him and the emperor. In the distant mountains it was all quiet. All of the horses were chewing. The Qin kingdom's war horses had been trained very well. They didn't even make a sound when they stepped on the ground. Thousands of elite riders of the Jingdo garrison were waiting in this valley, waiting for the final order to launch the attack. Thousands of armored riders charging toward the 30 black carriages on the road should not be a difficult mission. Regardless of whether it was General Shi standing at the very front, or the Jingdo garrison soldiers behind him who already knew the inside story, they all felt that this was perhaps the most difficult battle of their lives. Shi sat quietly on the back of his horse and put down the telescope in his hand. He did not forget that the Qin kingdom only produced a few pairs of this telescope. The one in his hand was a gift from Sir Fan Jr. during the new year. Shi had experienced countless battles in his life. He could truly be said to be someone who had been through hundreds of battles. 3 years ago, the Dongshan Road in the capital was in chaos. The commander of the Northern Expedition Camp, Yan Xiaoyi, rebelled and led thousands of soldiers to surround the Great Dong Mountain. The entire Northern Expedition Camp sank into chaos. Although the rebellion failed and the Northern Expedition Camp was like a group of dragons without a leader, it was very likely that a mutiny or defeat would occur. At that time, Shi received the emperor's important orders and entered the Northern Expedition Camp alone. With an imperial edict, he subdued tens of thousands of soldiers. It was because of this great service that he became the present commander of the Jingdo garrison. One person could subdue tens of thousands of people. Now, thousands of people were going to deal with an old man in a wheelchair who could not move easily. Shi was still very nervous. The group announcing the edict had already left. Shi prayed in his heart that Director Qin would retreat in front of the imperial edict. For some reason he knew that Qin Pingping would not retreat, not even by a single step. This was a very strange feeling. Perhaps the emperor knew that Qin Pingping did not want to retreat, so he had left a path of retreat for him. He didn't know what had happened between the emperor and Director Qin, but he knew that it must have been deeply entangled between the two of them. Even though Director Qin was about to retire, it forced the two of them to choose to fight face to face. The road illuminated by the torches seemed to sink into a kind of silence. Then Qin Pingping seemed to slowly shake his head again. Shi took a deep breath. The cold wind in the valley entered his lungs and made him feel a bit cold. He slowly pulled down the mask on his face and said in a heavy voice, "Get ready." Thousands of armored soldiers began to prepare to surround the former director of the Overwatch Council, Qin Pingping. "The emperor wants me to go back and ask me some things." Qin Pingping sat in the wheelchair and said with a smile, This is something I have long thought of, but I didn't expect that he would wait until now to ask about it. I also didn't expect that after asking about it, so many things would happen. He shook his head and sighed. The Emperor still doesn't understand me well enough. The Overwatch Council official suddenly knelt down by his side and gritted his teeth. You must follow the edict. No, I've been following edicts my entire life. Now that I'm going to die, what more should I follow? Chen Pingping smiled. The Emperor wants to ask me some things. How could I not want to ask him some things face to face? Then his face became cold and his gaze became icy. Looking at the hundreds of people illuminated by the torches, he said in an icy voice, in one's life, there are always some questions that have been lingering in one's mind for a long time that must be asked. With these words, the sound of hooves thundered outside Dajo. The shadows of armor reflected the moon. In an instant, it suppressed the light of the torches. A patch of dust rose in the dark night behind the road. In just a few breaths, it had come near the line of carriages. Thousands of armored soldiers spread out silently and fiercely. Everyone's faces turned deathly pale as they stared blankly at this scene. As for the delicate women in the caravan, they couldn't help but scream in fright when they saw this scene. Chen Pingping's expression did not change as he sat in his wheelchair. However, a mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. He didn't speak. None of the Overwatch Council subordinates acted. They only gripped the handles of the metal rods tightly. Their fingers curled around the rings of the crossbows as they stared nervously at the riders charging toward them from the fields on either side of the road. What was different from normal battles was that the thousands of riders did not use this momentum to charge directly into the carriages and begin a slaughter. Instead, they willingly gave up the advantage of the riders' momentum and slowed down at the last moment. They only formed into 3 sharp points and surrounded the 30 carriages. Thousands of armored cavalrymen marched on the black official road, under the red torches and under the silver moon, forming a terrifying scene. It was a murderous scene. The old servant pushed his wheelchair and slowly turned around. Chen Pingping rested his chin on the armrest and looked at the general hidden from head to toe in armor in the fields beside the road. Smiling slightly, he said, "You want to capture me with just 3,600 people? General Shi, are you looking down on me too much?" Riding on his horse, Shi Fei struggled in his heart. He didn't give his subordinates an immediate order to charge because he hoped the situation could still take a turn for the better. He was not willing to completely fall out with the Overwatch Council like this. He didn't know what Chen Pingping had up his sleeves and didn't care about them. He had to consider what kind of wretched fate awaited him in the future if he was loyal to the Emperor and became a mortal enemy of the Overwatch Council. He was afraid of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, but he was even more afraid of the Emperor. That was why he had come today but still hadn't taken action. Hearing Director Chen's words, his body on the horse trembled slightly. In a raspy and pained voice he said, "Director, if you resist the edict and take in an imperial criminal, I will have no choice but to." Before he could finish, Chen Pingping had already frowned and smiled. As expected, it's always a problem of officials disobeying the imperial edict, and not a problem of the monarch sending troops to ambush an old official who has returned home. He sighed and said, "Our Majesty, even at such a time, has not forgotten to maintain his grand and righteous image. Naturally, a shady character like me naturally has to play my role well." Out of the 30 carriages, other than the carriages carrying luggage and women, the Overwatch Council escorts totaled less than 100 people. However, it was these 100 Overwatch Council officials who faced the Jingdo garrison's 3,000 riders that did not show any signs of retreat. Their expressions were as cold as always. Shi Fei watched this scene quietly and sighed in his heart. The Overwatch Council only had eyes for Director Chen. Where was the Emperor? Faced with the Emperor's edict, these Overwatch Council officials only knew to protect the Director's safety. They didn't even need to think about it. No wonder the Emperor was so afraid of this matter. Shadows swayed faintly in the woods on either side of the road. No one knew how many assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council were inside. Shi Fei suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and leaned against the wheelchair. It was as if he was about to fall asleep in the night wind. Regarding the matter of naming the children, thank you for everyone's trust. Many readers have made similar requests, but I have never dared to accept them because I know my standards are very poor. Thinking of Ping Ping, Sua Sua, Dien Dien, Duo Duo, Cici, Ruoruo, Do Do. Does anyone still dare to let me name them? I scratched my head. In the past, I had given a few names to my friends' children, such as Yiwen and Yusu. Other than the latter, the first few were all cursed, particularly after the children grew up. Chapter 691. Shi Fei stared in a daze at the old man in the wheelchair. After a moment of silence, he slowly pulled up the visor on his face, revealing a determined and cold face. He was, after all, an important official in the Qing military. Ever since he had taken over as commander of the Jingdo garrison, he knew that his life was no longer just bitterly holding on under Shang Shanhu's pressure on the North Road. He had to actively or passively choose something. Before the emperor's imperial edict, he had no choice. He could only come to Dazhou and surround Qin Pingping's group of carriages returning home. Since he had already been surrounded and had already taken action, there was no possibility of stopping. The war horses were in the fields, gently and uneasily stepping on the early autumn plants. They were ready to charge at any moment. Shi Fei slowly raised his right hand. The 3,000 armored riders in the fields began to slowly change their formation and pressed closer toward the carriages on the road. It startled the women in the carriages into another soft cry. Ho! A clear and sharp whistle rang out from the black carriages. No one knew which Overwatch Council official in charge of Qin Pingping was the first to give the order under the threat of the Qing riders. Ho! Oh! After the 12 shouts, countless black crossbows stretched out from the carriages. Countless strong bows were hidden under the shafts, behind the horses and beside the carriages. At the same time, countless Overwatch Council assassins began to completely hide their traces in the dark mountain forests. After the first cry rang out on both sides of the road, countless clear and cold whistles rang out from the carriages made up of 30 black carriages. Immediately following it was a series of closely packed sounds of springs and the clashing of metal. There was the wretched sound of bowstrings snapping, the muffled sound of crossbows tightening, and the grinding sound of metal rods being unsheathed. Countless heart-palpitating sounds quickly spread out in the long line of carriages in the shape of a wave, in accordance with an extremely well-practiced and tacit order. The tips of the crossbows all shone with a frightening blue light. The poison abilities of the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council were, without question, the most powerful in the world. Shi Fei, who had just slowly lowered his right arm, looked at this scene. His pupils rapidly constricted. He knew how terrifying the Overwatch Council was, but he had not thought that there would be so many crossbowmen hidden in a mere 30 black carriages, as well as those travelers in the night. Shi Fei knew this was an order from the Overwatch Council. Once the word "ho" ended and someone gave the order, the poisoned arrows would shoot viciously toward the 3,000 riders under him. Even if the main cavalry could break through the Overwatch Council's defensive ring of carriages, how many people would die? After those poison metals were inserted into the bodies of the boys, how many of them could survive? Shi Fei narrowed his eyes as if trying to hide the coldness in his heart and the narrowing of his pupils. His body and mind seemed to have been shaken by the cold and emotionless voices earlier. He rode his horse and stood closest to the road. He could clearly see that a few hemp-clothed swordsmen were already standing in front of Director Qin. Director Qin still had his head slightly lowered. It was as if he was not afraid of the thousands of riders that were about to arrive. The sound of the hooves was like thunder. At this moment the two sides were very close. The sound of thunder rang in their ears. The Dazhou bailiffs and soldiers on the road had long shrunk to the back in fear. The internal court eunuchs led by He Qigan and the aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice also had pale faces. They had never thought that the task of capturing a court criminal would become the court's most secretive operation. The only person whose expression did not change was Qin Pingping in his wheelchair, the hemp-clothed men by his side, the old servant behind him, the Overwatch Council officials on the carriage holding crossbows, bows and metal rods. In other words, the officials of the Overwatch Council had nerves of steel that normal people did not have. Faced with the metal riders that seemed to cover the mountains and plains charging toward them, not even their eyelashes trembled. Not even the fingers gripping the crossbows trembled. They were not afraid or nervous. They only waited coldly for the last order, the order to launch a counterattack after the 12th, wait, was said. Shi Fei's hand gripped the scabbard at his waist tightly. He narrowed his eyes and stared closely at Qin Pingping, who was not far in front of him. He felt that his surroundings had become strange because of the Overwatch Council's silence and coldness. The Jingdo garrison riders scattered around the road were not far. Why did it seem like they had charged for a long time and still had not charged over? This feeling was too strange. Shi Fei blinked and found that his eyes were a bit sore. His nervousness gave him the illusion that his right arm had just sunk in while the riders were just beginning to pick up speed. Shi Fei rode alone at the very front. He didn't know when the Overwatch Council people would begin to attack him. Even if the Jingdo garrison riders could actually break through the line of defense formed by these cold Overwatch Council officials, he still did not feel any joy. He did not want to see the scene happen because he had no control over what might happen after this charge, such as the knife that could stretch out from behind him at any moment. Qin Pingping waved his hand at Shi Fei from his wheelchair. He did not look like an old man being chased and attacked. Instead, he looked like an elder who had something to tell him. Shi Fei's face showed a struggling expression. Suddenly, he squeezed the horse's belly and cried out, "Retreat!" This cry rang out like thunder on both sides of the road. As an important official in the military, General Shi Fei's personal cultivation was indeed very powerful. His voice quickly traveled into the field of riders that were already very close to each other. Military orders were like mountains. Following Shi Fei's explosive cry, all of the generals and vanguards gave a muffled grunt and forcefully pulled the horses that had already reached their top speed to a stop. Countless pairs of metal hands viciously pulled back on the tough reins. Even the old, calloused hands were pulled until blood came out. Finally, the wildly charging iron riders stopped less than a dozen feet from the road. However, there were still a dozen riders who were unable to steady themselves. The horses gave two muffled grunts. Their legs gave way and they crashed directly into the stone walls on both sides of the road. Limbs broke and blood flowed. There was the sound of hurried breathing and nervous gazes met. General Shi Fei roared. The 3,000 iron riders suddenly stopped. This person's skill at controlling soldiers was indeed first-rate in the world. However, with this, the iron riders lost their advantage in speed. The two sides were also very close. The Jingdo garrison riders were completely exposed to the Overwatch Council's arrows. It was like they had taken off the clothes of a virgin and were standing naked in front of countless lechers. After the Ho words, all of the Overwatch Council subordinates had been waiting calmly. Even though the invading riders had suddenly made such a big mistake and given the Overwatch Council such a good opportunity, they still did not take the initiative to act. Instead, they only watched coldly at the densely packed riders. Shi Fei breathed heavily a few times. The armor on his chest rose and fell slightly. There was no cold sweat on his body. Since he had chosen to take the risk, he would not regret his choice. A moment later, he coldly urged his horse forward. Under the watchful gazes of the Overwatch Council officials and the aim of the dark arrows, he opened up a path and trotted toward Qin Pingping. The horse stopped not far in front of the wheelchair. Shi Fei maintained his respect and dismounted. The weight of the armor on his body made his footsteps appear heavy. In the quiet night, they made a muffled humming sound. Qin Pingping looked at this brave general and smiled slightly. Revealing an expression of admiration, he said, "With outstanding young people like you in the future of the Qin Kingdom, there should not be any problems. Since it is so, I do not want to kill you." Shi Fei was silent for a long time. He then knelt on one knee in front of Qin Pingping's wheelchair. Taking off the helmet and holding it to his chest, he said, "I beg the old director to follow the edict." "Follow which edict?" Qin Pingping looked at him calmly and admired his decisiveness from the bottom of his heart. Earlier, Lao Wang had also told him to follow the edict. However, he smiled slightly and said, "I am taking Gouda with me. As for following the edict, you know that the emperor has never thought I would follow the edict. If you advise me to follow the edict now, I'm afraid that the emperor will not be happy if he finds out." Shi Fei did not reply to this question. Standing up, he said, "The garrison is the Qin Kingdom's garrison, and the Overwatch Council is the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council. I don't want either side to suffer any losses." Qin Pingping glanced at him with slight mockery and said, 3,640 elite riders of the Jingdo garrison have pursued you for thousands of li. Do you think it is as simple as following the edict or not? Of course, this matter was not as simple as obeying or not obeying the edict. Shi Fei was only expressing his attitude in front of the Overwatch Council and Dajo officials. After hearing the number 3,640, his heart couldn't help but grow cold. He knew that the fear he had hidden in the depths of his heart was real. If he had not taken the risk to stop the charge of the riders earlier, perhaps the first person to fall right now would have been him. There were people from the old director in the Jingdo garrison. This was what Shi Fei was most afraid of. The emperor has given a strict edict that the criminal Gouda must be brought back to the capital. Shi Fei took a deep breath and swallowed away all of his unease. Looking at Qin Pingping, he coldly said, "Even if you want to defy the edict, I must still bring him back." "I will follow you back to the capital," Qin Pingping slowly said as he closed his eyes. Shi Fei was shocked. Standing in front of Qin Pingping, he didn't know what to say. The helmet in his arms felt very heavy. At the same time, the Overwatch Council official by Qin Pingping's side also paled in shock. Even the most powerful hemp-clothed swordsman of the 6th Bureau by his side revealed shocked expressions. "Director, you cannot return to the capital," the Overwatch Council official who called himself the deputy head of the 2nd Bureau suddenly said angrily. Qin Pingping slowly opened his eyes. He knew that only the old servant behind him would not be surprised by this decision. He smiled slightly at Shifei and said, "Why didn't you charge over earlier? Presumably, you know that it is impossible for you to control everything here with just 3,000 riders. In reality, the only one who can control all of this is me. If I want to go with you, you can only take me with you." The face of the Overwatch Council official beside him suddenly froze. It was like his face had been smeared with a strange layer of makeup. However, there was a glimmer of terror and unease in this stiffness. Qin Pingping ignored the shock displayed by his loyal subordinates. He only looked coldly at Shifei and said, "Since the situation is under my control, I should be the one to decide what to do." Shifei looked at him in a daze. His fingers unconsciously gripped the air hole in his helmet tightly. In a raspy voice he said, "If the director follows me back to the capital, please give your orders." Asking the director to follow the edict was a lie. Of course, Shifei knew that the emperor's intention was to capture old Director Qin alive and bring him back to the capital. However, this was originally an impossible task. Yet, right now, it seemed that it was about to become real. "I brought 30 carriages worth of luggage and women." Qin Pingping looked at Shifei with a slight smile. "I know what the emperor's edict is, so you don't need to hide anything from me. What I want you to do now is to pretend you never saw these luggage and women." Shifei's breathing became heavy. A glimmer of blood rose to his eyes. "You know the emperor's edict?" Qin Pingping smiled warmly. "I know better than anyone what kind of person the emperor is. If I don't completely destroy what I care about, how could he be happy?" The gaze of the old man in the wheelchair was very deep. Slowly he said, "My life should have ended a long time ago, but those luggage would not be damaged. Those women are as youthful as flowers." He sighed and said, "If I didn't have to send them out of Jingdo, why would I have to leave Jingdo and accompany the emperor in such a big circle?" Shifei's throat was very dry. He stared at Qin Pingping in a daze. Only now did he know that everything that had happened in Dazhou, although it was not completely under the old director's control, was still within his calculations. He had long known that the emperor would send him after him. He also knew how cold and heartless the emperor's edict was. Other than Qin Pingping, no one there would be left alive. However, Qin Pingping had used this to gather everyone he wanted to protect in one spot in Dazhou. Then he easily controlled the situation and forced Shifei to silently accept this reality. He used Qin Pingping's return to the capital alone in exchange for everyone's safety. The question was, could Qin Pingping easily control the situation? There would always be a limit to the arrows in the 30 carriages. There would always be a limit to the number of swordsmen in the darkness. With 3,600 Jingdo garrison soldiers charging toward them, how long could the Overwatch Council actually hold out? Shifei narrowed his eyes. He remembered the emperor's secret edict clearly. Other than Qin Pingping, leave no one alive. Leave no one alive. Presumably the emperor wants to leave no one alive. Qin Pingping looked at him with faint mockery. "I pity the people of the Qin kingdom and these soldiers of the garrison. That's why I'm giving you a chance. Otherwise I could also leave no one alive." Shifei didn't believe these words. He looked at Qin Pingping calmly. He had to make a choice between this terrifying figure and the emperor's strict edict. He had to capture Gouda and bring him back. The people here had to die. Perhaps he didn't understand. From the beginning of his fear and when he handed the secret edict to the soldier, he didn't have the courage to hope that he could actually kill all of the Overwatch Council people. What helped Shifei make his choice was a black line that suddenly appeared on the surrounding hills. These black lines floated up from each hill. Under the silver moonlight, it was as if someone had used a very black charcoal pencil to thicken these unremarkable mountain valley lines. These black lines were made up of people. To be more precise, they were made up of a black cavalryman and another black cavalryman. Countless black cavalrymen stood on top of the mountain, forming these black lines. The Black Knights. A faint smile rose to the lips of the Overwatch Council officials in the carriages, who had been vigilantly watching the riders in the fields and holding crossbows tightly in their hands. They did not know that Director Qin had already made a shocking decision. They only looked at the seemingly endless number of Black Knights on the mountain and once again confirmed that in the mountains and fields of the Qin Kingdom, the Overwatch Council was always invincible. Contrary to the emotions of the Overwatch Council officials, when the black lines appeared on the hill and gradually became clear under the silver moonlight, illuminating the black armor that seemed to carry the will of the Netherworld, the Jingdo garrison riders who had come to kill the Overwatch Council all sank into a state of terror and despair. It was not they who had surrounded the Overwatch Council. Rather, it was the Overwatch Council who had surrounded them. What had surrounded them was the Overwatch Council's most powerful martial force, the most powerful riders in the world, the Black Knights. There was a death-like silence. Fei slowly withdrew his gaze from the Black Knights. The Black Knights were still some distance away, but he knew their power. If the Black Knights charged down like this, none of the riders of the Jingdo garrison would be able to survive. What made Fei feel even more angry and shocked was that the Overwatch Council's powerful Black Knights had always been strictly limited by the court to less than 1,000 people. Yet there were clearly more than 4,000 black-armored riders on the hill. He abruptly turned his head and stared at Qin Pingping. "You knew long ago that the Emperor would order me to ambush in Dazhou?" "No, I never had to calculate such things. I only knew that the Emperor could not bear for me to leave." Qin Pingping looked at him coldly. "Now you can think about my conditions." Fei's body began to tremble in anger. The court strictly ordered that the Black Knights should not exceed 1,000. This is treason. Qin Pingping looked at him calmly and said, "So what?" Fei's confidence was completely destroyed by these words. He stood in front of the wheelchair as if he had lost something. A moment later he said in a raspy voice, "If the Emperor doesn't personally act, no one in this world can keep you here. Why didn't you leave? Why did you wait for me to appear?" "Because I never wanted to leave." Qin Pingping looked at him calmly and slowly said, "I just came to see someone off." Fei returned to his subordinates. The riders of the Jingdo garrison did not set up camp. They just stood there tiredly and helplessly. A feeling of defeat and helplessness enveloped the thousands of riders. As the pride of the Qin kingdom, the elite riders of the Jingdo garrison had followed the Overwatch Council carriages for a number of days. It was not until this moment that they realized that in the eyes of the old man in the wheelchair, their thousands of seemingly powerful riders were nothing more than a joke. Fei closed his eyes to rest. He had long agreed to all of Qin Pingping's conditions. In such a situation he had no choice but to agree. However, he still did not understand why someone as meticulous as Director Qin, who had clearly arranged for the Black Knights to come and receive him, would be willing to follow the Jingdo garrison back to the capital. All of His Majesty's thoughts had fallen into Director Chen's speculations and plans. Fei closed his eyes. His respect for Director Chen had reached another level. He knew that the only person who could control everything in the training hall was indeed Director Chen, and it would never be him. There was already a large empty space in front of the black carriages. Dozens of Overwatch Council officials were kneeling in front of the black wheelchair and furiously kowtowing, begging the old man in the wheelchair not to follow the Jingdo garrison back to the capital. At this moment, all of the Overwatch Council officials knew exactly what the Emperor was thinking. If Director Qin truly returned to Jingdo, there would be no way out. When the Overwatch Council officials first entered the academy, they were taught to be loyal to the Qin kingdom and the Emperor. However, the Overwatch Council subordinates who had escorted Qin Pingping back to the capital were the ones who had followed him the longest. Although they were still loyal to the Qin kingdom and the Emperor in the depths of their hearts, when Qin Pingping's life was seriously threatened, they instinctively stood behind Qin Pingping as a replacement for his unhealthy back. They were people of the Overwatch Council, and the Overwatch Council was Qin Pingping's Overwatch Council. This dark and gloomy council had long been branded with countless dark and cold marks emanating from Qin Pingping's body. Even though Qin Pingping had been so glorious these few years, he was still unable to completely get rid of this dark and cold aura. If there really was such a thing as personal charisma in this world, if a dark personality also had charisma, then Qin Pingping was, without question, the most charismatic person in the world. He had all of his trusted subordinates dead set on him. Qin Pingping gently stroked the armrest of the wheelchair and gently tapped it, making a buzzing sound. He looked with relief at his subordinates kneeling on the ground in front of him. There was not a trace of sadness at parting on his face. There was only satisfaction in his life's work. He wanted to return to Jingdo. He had never thought of leaving Jingdo. This had nothing to do with his work, the future of the Qin Kingdom, or the Overwatch Council. It only had to do with his own life. "I am just returning to the capital to talk about the past with the Emperor. What are you crying about?" He furrowed his brows and swept his gaze around with disapproval. All of the Overwatch Council officials closed their mouths. A few of the crying officials lowered their heads in shame. These subordinates of the Overwatch Council could not understand. Even if the Emperor wanted to defeat the old director, he already had control of the entire situation. On the other side, the elite riders of the Jingdo garrison led by General Shifei had already become grasshoppers at the end of autumn. They couldn't even find a glimmer of courage. Why did the director still want to return to Jingdo to die? As for why the Emperor wanted to defeat the old director, these subordinates did not know. They just unconsciously thought that this was probably an inevitability of history. Did the old director know too much of the Emperor's dark secrets? Chen Pingping tiredly shooed these subordinates away, leaving behind only the deputy head of the second bureau who had been standing guard by his side. He looked at him calmly and said, "I've counted the days. And Ji still needs many days to return to the capital. Logically speaking, no one can tell him the news ahead of time." The official lowered his head and sighed. "None of us can change the decision you have made. Perhaps only Sir Fan Jr. can change all of this." "No, even he can't change this matter." Chen Pingping looked at him coldly. Chen Pingping looked at him coldly and said, "Don't think you can tell Fan Xian anything just because you are the fastest person in the world. I left you here to tell you that this is my order. In a moment you will follow the Black Knights to send these 30 carriages straight into Jiangbei. You must enter Dongyi as quickly as possible and then find the person I told you about earlier. Through him, find 10 Family Village." The official had not thought that the old director would destroy the thoughts in the depths of his heart with one sentence. A glimmer of sorrow rose to his frozen face. "Don't laugh and cry at the same time. Otherwise this mask won't last long." Chen Pingping looked at him coldly. "Wang Qinian, when you escaped from Dong Mountain on your own, you thought you were thinking for Fan Xian's sake. Have you thought about how much trouble you've brought Fan Xian and me?" The masked official was Wang Qinian, who had been missing for 3 years. Fan Xian knew that he had disappeared under Chen Pingping's arrangements. He had secretly thought about investigating and thought about it for a long time. Presumably, he would never have guessed that Chen Pingping had arranged for Wang Qinian to be in the Overwatch Council. Wang Qinian took a deep breath and said, "I still don't understand. Why do you want to go back? Don't you think that regardless of whether you live or die in the end, Sir Fan Jr. will be caught up in the trouble you don't want him to be caught up in?" Chen Pingping didn't answer this question. He only looked coldly at his black carriages. He suddenly felt that this black color was pleasing to the eye and made one feel happy. The Jingdo garrison obediently moved aside. The 29 black carriages continued to advance along the road toward the east of the Qin Kingdom amidst the Overwatch Council officials' sadness, anger, and other complicated emotions. Surrounded by the cries of the beautiful women in Qin Garden, the carriages continued forward. The black wheelchair, however, was left behind. It was left alone. Chen Pingping touched the flying hair at his temples and said with a slight smile to the old servant behind him, "Your body is better than mine. Why accompany me to death?" The old servant grinned and didn't say anything. A portion of the black lines on the hill had already been cut off. A portion of the Black Knights had already begun to secretly follow the 30 black carriages and leave. There were still many Black Knights that remained coldly stationed on the hill, monitoring the movements of the Jingdo garrison. Shifei came to the wheelchair with a calm expression. After a moment of silence he said, "On behalf of the garrison, I thank the director for not killing me." Chen Pingping smiled and didn't say anything. Shifei lowered his head and asked, "But I still don't understand why. If I wanted to leave earlier, what would you have done?" Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes and looked at the dots of fire on the road in the distance. After a moment of silence, Shifei said, "I'm His Majesty's subject. Even if I know I'm no match for them, I'll fight to the last man. Yes, this is a compromise. If I stay, fewer of your people will die and fewer of the Overwatch Council's people will die. You should know that I have never thought my life was so worthless," Chen Pingping said with a smile. "I am an old man. My life is truly worthless. The Jingdo garrison is loyal to the Qin Kingdom. The Overwatch Council is loyal to the Qin Kingdom. I am also loyal to the Qin Kingdom." The old man in the wheelchair said gently, "I've killed many people in my life, but I'm only willing to kill my enemies. I don't have the habit of killing my own people." Shifei did not understand. He did not understand the so-called loyalty to the Qin Kingdom. What were these 4,000 Black Knights that exceeded the limit? What's the big deal about disobeying the decree? Chen Pingping didn't say anything more. He just sat calmly. In his heart, the Qin Kingdom was the Qin Kingdom and the Emperor was the Emperor. From many years ago, these two were not the same thing in his heart. He wanted to go back to Jingdo and ask that man, but he didn't want the entire Qin kingdom to sink into turmoil because of his rupture with that man. He also didn't want the battle between the court and the Overwatch Council to cause countless Qin people to lose their homes. Thus, he chose to return to the capital and have the Overwatch Council retreat in front of the Jingdo garrison. When all was said and done, this was a battle between Qin Pingping and the Qing Emperor. Neither of them wanted this private matter to become a battle within the Qin kingdom. "Go back," Qin Pingping said quietly. "Yes, director." All sorts of feelings rose in Shifei's heart. He waved his hand to summon the black carriage the Overwatch Council had left behind and bowed respectfully to Qin Pingping. Only then did he carefully carry the black wheelchair into the black carriage. At this moment, the line formed by the Black Knights on the hill suddenly became somewhat disorderly. Sitting by the carriage door, Qin Pingping seemed to sense something and abruptly turned his head to look. His gaze was incomparably sharp. In an instant, the Black Knights helplessly and sorrowfully calmed down. Chapter 692. On the hill in the night, the faint silver moon swam in and out of the clouds, making the place flicker between bright and dark. Jinggu stared at the lonely carriage on the road at the foot of the mountain. A moment later, an angry snort came out of his silver mask. The black and incomparably sturdy spear hung beside his warhorse. His hands were not the only ones on the horse's reins. Ever since the rebellion in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qin calendar, the Qin family had been destroyed. In front of the tens of thousands of people in the royal palace, the silver-masked Jinggu who had challenged Qin Heng had become a legendary figure. In particular, during these 3 years, Qin Pingping had purposely given up power to cultivate the new power of the Overwatch Council. In order to smoothly hand over this council to Fan Xian, as Fan Xian's trusted aide, Jinggu had taken over the position of commander of the Black Knights of the 5th Bureau. In the instant the old man in the wheelchair at the foot of the mountain had been carried into the carriage, a glimmer of despair and anger rose in Jingji's heart. Squeezing his horse's belly, he prepared to lead his Black Knights to charge down and snatch the person. He could not just watch as Director Qin stepped onto the road to certain death on his way back to the capital. Back then he had been bullied and humiliated in the army camp. During a routine drill, he had howled and attacked in self-defense. Unexpectedly, he had killed the eldest son of the Qin family. From that day on, he had been thrown into the Qin kingdom's death prison. The family and wife he had left behind in his hometown had all been secretly killed by the Qin family in revenge. He was already a dead man, but unexpectedly, Qin Pingping secretly saved him and arranged for him to be part of the Shadow Knights. He wore a silver mask to hide his true appearance. For the sake of revenge, for the sake of repaying the debt of gratitude, he had been promoted to the position of deputy commander in the Shadow Knights. Fan Xian had given him a chance for revenge, so he was very grateful to Fan Xian. However, he knew that it was Qin Pingping who had given him a second life. In his heart, the silver-masked Jinggu saw Director Qin as a second parent. On the mountain, Qin Pingping's wheelchair got into the carriage. A murderous intent surged in his heart, and he was about to rush down when the bald man beside him coldly pulled on the reins. Jinggu looked back angrily. His eyes, as deep as the netherworld, stared at the baldy through the holes in the silver mask. However, he did not attack because this baldy had more seniority in the Overwatch Council than him and had once held a more important position. This baldy was the previous head of the 7th Bureau that Fan Xian had met in the Overwatch Council prison. "The director has said that your mission is to take these 4,000 Black Knights and escort the carriages out of the country. Then, you must ensure that these 4,000 Black Knights are all handed over to Sir Fan Jr.'s hands without a single exception." The bald man's face appeared particularly old and tired. In the depths of his heart he was just like Jinggu, filled with sorrow and anger. However, he was Qin Pingping's most trusted old official. He had appeared among the Black Knights today on the old director's orders to suppress any possible unrest in the Black Knights. "Do you know that if the director returns to the capital, he will never be able to come out again?" Jinggu looked at him coldly and slowly asked, enunciating each word. "This is the director's will. Everything I have done is done in accordance with his will." The bald leader's expression was calm. He did not retreat a single step. Jinggu stared in a daze at the road. He then saw Qin Pingping at the carriage door, looking back at him with a sharp gaze. His body trembled. He slowly raised his right hand and formed it into a fist, restraining the violent emotions in the hearts of his subordinates. After a long time, Jinggu watched the black carriages slowly embark on the road back to the capital while being surrounded or escorted by 3,000 elite riders of the Jingdo garrison. Jinggu took a deep breath and slowly took off the silver mask on his face, revealing the terrifying and wretched wound. He didn't speak for a long time. He bid farewell to Qin Pingping. He knew that he would probably never see the old director again. The usually cold Jingji's eyes became slightly moist. The bald leader continued to stare in that direction in silence. There was a slight smile on his face, but a joyous desire to die gradually rose in his eyes. The bald leader dismounted from his horse and knelt down toward the quiet road. Very respectfully he kowtowed. Jinggu looked at his expression and felt slightly shocked. He knew that once this elder completed his task of watching him leave the country, he would probably leave with Director Qin. His heart felt slightly sorrowful, but he didn't say anything. He only looked at him calmly. He then dismounted from his horse and kowtowed in that direction. All of the Black Knights dismounted at the same time and knelt down densely on the small hill. They kowtowed toward the road that no longer had people or carriages and bid farewell to Director Qin. A moment later, Jinggu carefully put on the silver mask on his face. In a raspy voice he gave the order, "Retreat. Head east." These 4,000 Black Knights were the Overwatch Council's most powerful and reliable martial power. Regardless of how the Emperor wanted to deal with Qin Pingping or what methods the court would think of to weaken the Overwatch Council to offset any possible backlash from Qin Pingping, the Black Knights would always be the most important in the eyes of the court. Since Jinggu accepted Qin Pingping's orders, he had to send these 4,000 Black Knights safely out of the Qin Kingdom's borders and into Fan Xian's hands. This was one of the last gifts Qin Pingping would give Fan Xian. The silver-masked Jinggu knew that his mission was very important. Thus, when he led the Black Knights down the hill, his back was also very heavy. If Qin Pingping was truly willing to fight the Emperor head-on, these 4,000 Black Knights moving freely between the Qin Kingdom's provinces could, without question, start from within the Qin Kingdom and cut countless bone-deep wounds in the Qin Kingdom's abdomen. Additionally, there were spies the Overwatch Council had planted in the various ministries and border armies. It would not be difficult for Qin Pingping's final struggle to throw the entire Qin Kingdom into turmoil. However, Qin Pingping did not have such a choice. He would rather return to the capital alone to face the incomparably powerful emperor than have the Overwatch Council subordinates loyal to him shed all pretenses of cordiality with the court and start a great battle. He protected the interests of the Qin court to the greatest extent. After all, he was loyal to the Qin Kingdom. Of course, someone as scheming and deep as Qin Pingping would not allow his Overwatch Council men to be toyed with by the court and the emperor because of his return to the capital. He knew that under the Emperor's powerful strength and in front of the Qin Kingdom's powerful machinery, even if the Overwatch Council used all its strength, it could, at most, throw the world into turmoil. It would not be able to guarantee its own survival. He did not want the Overwatch Council men to come to any harm. Thus, he chose to follow the carriages out of the capital and to Dazhou. Then, he cleverly gathered the people he wanted to protect and the power he wanted to leave Fan Xian with to have them far away from Jingdou, a place of trouble. This included Wang Qinian, the accompanying beauties on the carriages, the Overwatch Council officials most loyal to him, the old head of the 7th Bureau who had followed him for 30 years, and, of course, the 4,000 Black Knights he had secretly managed for many years. These were all people Qin Pingping believed had to survive. They were also people Fan Xian needed. These people were silently and sorrowfully advancing in the dark night. They were preparing to cross the Qin Kingdom's borders and enter deep into Dongyi, which was already controlled by Fan Xian and the Great Prince. From then on, they would break away from the Qing Emperor's control and truly become an independent and powerful power in Fan Xian's hands. These powers were the bargaining chips Qin Pingping had left for Fan Xian. They could allow Fan Xian to negotiate with the Emperor. However, these bargaining chips had their own emotions and their own friendships. The Black Knights searched for mountain paths around the official roads and advanced like ghosts. Under the bald head's cold gaze, the silver-masked Jinggu could only give up on the idea of sending soldiers forward to slaughter the Jingdou garrison riders and take back the old director. On the carriages they were protecting, the officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council had even deeper thoughts. Wang Qinian's disguised face was not only stiff, it also seemed to have aged. He glanced at Gauda beside him, covered in blood. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "The director returned to the capital, only to seek death." Gauda was still in a semi-conscious state, and the mute woman could not speak. She looked at the man in astonishment, not knowing who he was talking to. Outside the slowly advancing carriage, someone suddenly sighed. A normal-looking Overwatch Council official pushed open the carriage door and walked in. Sitting across from Wang Qinian, he said after a moment of silence, "Everyone knows but no one can stop it. You should know that the director is doing this for the benefit of the council. He doesn't want the Qin kingdom to be shaken. He also doesn't want the duke to be involved. Zhong Jue, you've been following me. Are you afraid I'll go inform Sir Fan Jr.? Wang Qinian had no intention of joking. He only looked coldly at his companion across from him and said each word clearly. If the director dies, it would be impossible for Sir Fan Jr. not to get involved. Since it is so, why not make this move earlier? In this world, the only person who can stop what happens in Jingdo is him. Sitting across from him was Zhong Jue. He and Wang Qinian were known as the two wings of the Overwatch Council. Traveling thousands of li in tracking, he was one of the two most powerful people in the world. He looked at Wang Qinian and calmly said, "Before the director left, he gave you strict orders to not inform Sir Fan Jr." Wang Qinian suddenly furrowed his brows and said, "I heard that Sir Fan Jr. has already left Dongyi. Along the way he was chased by a number of Dongyi rebel soldiers. How did those Dongyi rebel soldiers know the Overwatch Council's return route?" Zhong Jue didn't reply. Wang Qinian stared at him and said, "It was the old director who spread the news. He wanted to stop Fan Xian from returning to the capital early. He wanted to end all of this before Fan Xian returned." Zhong Jue silently agreed to this point. Wang Qinian slowly lowered his head and said, "It will take some time for Dazhou to return to the capital. If I leave the carriages now and rush to the east of Yanjing to inform Sir Fan Jr., he should still have time to return to Jingdo." A complicated emotion suddenly rose in Zhong Jue's eyes. "All these years I've been following the old director. You've been following Sir Fan Jr. The mission the director gave me was to keep an eye on you." He sighed. "The director is correct. Those who follow Sir Fan Jr. for a long time become different from us. They become overly impulsive and don't think about the results." Then he said seriously, "I must carry out the director's orders. I cannot let you drag Sir Fan Jr. into this." "You can stop me?" Wang Qinian stared at him and asked. "The two of us have never had a clear winner, even when you were a civil servant a few years ago." A strange smile rose to Zhong Jue's face. Immediately after, his smile froze on his face because the hilt of a knife had silently touched his waist, causing half of his body to go numb. Immediately after, Wang Qinian's palm turned into a knife and viciously chopped down on the back of his neck. He didn't even make a grunt before he fell onto the wooden planks of the carriage. The mute woman hugged her child and looked at this scene with a face full of shock. She was speechless. Holding the knife tightly, Gauda opened his eyes and breathed with great difficulty. He then said to Wang Qinian, "Let's go." Wang Qinian glanced at him and slowly nodded his head. "Sir Fan Jr. said that living is the most important. I think he is also willing to let the old director live." Gauda coughed and coughed up blood. In a raspy voice he said, "Time nonsense." Wang Qinian gave an ugly smile. Turning around, he pushed aside the curtain of the black carriage and swept out like a gust of wind. The night was dark and heavy. The only person in the world who could catch up to him, Zhong Jue, was unconscious in the carriage. He was going to notify Fan Xian. Presumably no one would be able to stop him. However, he didn't know if he would make it in time. When Fan Xian learned of everything that had happened in Jingdo and Dazhou and rushed back, would Qin Pingping still be able to sit safely in his wheelchair? The night was as cold as water and as black as ink. Mixing together, it was like ink and water, transforming into countless shapes of wind and sand that were difficult to grasp. A number of days later, the riders of the Jingdo garrison finally rushed back to the outskirts of Jingdo. Because there was a black carriage that could not move very fast, the entire speed was suppressed to a very slow pace. However, no one had any objections. They even felt that the slower they went, the better. The commander of the garrison, Shi Fei, had been sitting in the carriage with Qin Pingping like a filial junior. He served Qin Pingping's food and water, daily life and rest. Usually he chatted with him about the Qin kingdom's past and future, the funny political stories in court, or the elusive rumors in the palace. It was truly like an old official had been taken back to Jingdo by his successor to retire. However, everyone knew that was not the truth. It was already autumn. When the Jingdo garrison who had invited Qin Pingping back, rushed back to Jingdo, they purposely chose the darkest hour before dawn. There was a sliver of white on the eastern horizon, but it was not very bright. It was unable to display the clear autumn sky of Jingdo in front of everyone's eyes. Everyone could only smell the extremely light air, so light that there was a thread of dryness, moving back and forth between their mouths and noses. Other than the dozen or so injured, The rest of the 3,600 riders surrounded the black carriage and arrived outside Jingdo's Jingyang Gate. Presumably, along the way, Shifei had already reported the situation in Dazhou to the Bureau of Military Affairs or Internal Court in Jingdo through top-secret channels. Thus, when the densely packed riders arrived in front of Jingdo's gates in the dark, the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards at the eastern gate were not shocked at all. They also did not raise any alarm signals that they should not have. It was quiet above and below the city walls. In the darkness, one could occasionally hear the sound of horses' hooves kicking. The patch of whiteness in the east only shone on the tall walls of Jingdo, making the topmost layer of black bricks give off a somber sound. The bird that had risen the hardest in the morning flew quickly in front of the city walls and let out a joyful cry. A heavy creak rang out. For once, the Jingdo city gates opened before the hour was up. Under the effect of the mechanism, the heavy city gates opened up a path that could allow a carriage to pass through. It was pitch black. It was impossible to see clearly what dangers were hidden inside. The soldiers of the 13 city gate guards stood on the city walls and looked warily and curiously at the city gate. They didn't know what had happened. Why was it that from their immediate superior to the strange appearance of the Jingdo garrison soldiers outside, it was as if they were facing a great enemy? All of the handover work was completed in a frightening silence. Under the control of the old servant, the black carriage slowly entered Jingdo's city gates. Until now, this carriage was still under the control of the old servant of the Overwatch Council. This carriage was still under the control of the old cripple in the carriage. None of the important military officials inside and outside the city dared to forcefully take the position of the driver of the carriage. No one lifted the curtain to verify the identity of the old man inside. Shifei silently watched the carriage enter Jingyang Gate and then slowly close the city gates. He knew his mission had finally been completed. Before he left, he had thought that the Jingdo garrison would have to sacrifice countless lives to complete his mission. Yet he had done it so easily. There was nothing else for him to do. Regardless of the emperor's anger at him not being able to completely complete his mission, Shifei did not care. He only stared in a daze at the tightly closed heavy city gates. Countless complicated emotions rose in his heart. The civil officials of the Qing court all felt disgust toward the Overwatch Council and the old cripple in the Overwatch Council other than fear. They thought that the old cripple was the emperor's old black dog, a terrifying fellow who bit everyone he met. In the eyes of the major military figures, the Overwatch Council was their most loyal, reliable, and powerful partner. Although they also had boundless fear of Qin Pingping, Shifei suddenly felt that this old man, who would rather return to the capital alone than have the Overwatch Council and the military fight a great battle, was worthy of his respect. He was silent for a long time. He then slowly waved his hand and led the 3,000 Jingdo garrison soldiers, who all had complicated emotions and had escaped the joy of their lives, slowly away from the heavy city walls and the man-eating city gates. The black horse carriage slowly entered Jingyang Gate and the heavy gate slowly closed. A few people slowly approached the carriage. It was currently the darkest time before dawn and the light was extremely dim. It was impossible to clearly see the faces of those people. The people in charge of waiting outside Jingyang Gate were all top figures in the Qing court. One was eunuch Yao, who had been sent by the palace. Another was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong, who controlled the armies of the world. The last was the traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zhongwei. The three of them approached the black carriage. For a moment no one spoke. In the end it was Yi Zhong who spoke. He gazed at the carriage and said in an even voice, "Director, it has been hard on you to return." Eunuch Yao calmly said, "Director, please follow me into the palace to see the emperor." He Zhongwei stood to the side and didn't speak. His face was calm. He maintained the silence he should maintain at this moment. There was silence in the carriage. After a long time, the old man slowly sighed and warmly said, "A lonely old man returning to the capital has disturbed your peace. I am truly apologetic." The carriage slowly moved. Under the collective escort of internal court eunuchs and military aces, it moved along the street under Jingyang Gate toward the royal palace in the center of Jingdo. It seemed that the Overwatch Council in Jingdo did not know that their ancestor had already returned to Jingdo and was about to face the emperor's towering anger. Even the officials in court and the Jingdo people with sharp senses did not know of this. It was a dark dawn. The trees on both sides of the street under Jingyang Gate were like countless boats swaying in the cool autumn wind. The street led directly to the royal palace. There were no pedestrians on either side. Presumably, it had long been purged and was under the highest level of martial law. It was empty and desolate. Only the black horse carriage was moving forward. It was moving forward in a lonely manner. It traveled until it reached the front of the brilliant royal palace. Coincidentally, the sun finally broke free of the restraints of the earth and leaped out, illuminating the royal palace. The fire-like warm golden light just happened to envelop the black carriage. Chapter 693. A few files of varying thickness lay quietly on the table in the royal study. In these short days, they had been flipped through countless times by that pair of steady eyes. Then, as if they had been forgotten, they were placed there with unusual silence. Time was not enough for dust to cover these files. However, the cool air of early autumn made the pages of these files curl up like they had been roasted by fire. That pair of deep and scorching eyes slowly moved away from the scroll, cast outside into the dim and dazzling light of the palace before dawn. The light from the east had already illuminated the highest brick on the walls of Jingdo, but it was still unable to shine into the royal palace, which was deeply locked in darkness by the city walls and palace walls. The Qing emperor expressionlessly picked up the teacup by his hand and took a sip. The tea was cold. The eunuchs who usually served by his side did not have the courage to come in and change it to hot as usual. An entire night had passed and all he drank was cold tea. Like a fish drinking water, only one knew if it was warm or cold. When the cold tea entered his chest and stomach, it turned into a burning stream of heat. Was it anger that was difficult to suppress? Was it the pain of being deceived by someone he trusted? Or was it a sense of humiliation that he had never felt before? That old dog had hidden it from him for decades. The angrier he got, the calmer he became. The Qing emperor was no longer as angry as he had been a few days ago. His expression and gaze were as calm as two pools of ice water, extremely cold and calm. It was not like an ancient well. It was like water that was about to turn to ice, blindly cold. This coldness spread around the royal study, making everyone who stopped outside feel a fear that came from the depths of their hearts. A familiar sound faintly rang out in the distance. It was the sound of a wheelchair rolling over the stone tiles of the royal palace. The special round chair and the cracks between the stone tiles rubbed endlessly. The width of the stone tiles was fixed, and the distance between the wheelchair and the stone tiles was fixed. Thus, the rhythm and timing of the sound of the wheelchair rolling over the stone tiles were also fixed. This kind of fixed rhythm had rung out countless times in the quiet royal palace during these decades. Each time the Qing emperor had something important to do or just wanted to talk, the sound of the wheelchair would travel from outside the palace into the palace, all the way into the royal study. In recent years, the sound of the wheelchair has lessened. That old black dog hides in the Qin garden to enjoy his life, leaving me alone in this cold palace to suffer. However, 3 years ago when he had to deal with Yunrui and those 3 strange creatures, the wheelchair had entered the palace twice. The Qing emperor's expression was indifferent. In an instant he thought of many past events. He then slowly raised his head. When his calm and deep gaze landed on the tightly shut wooden door of the imperial study, the sound of the wheelchair rubbing against the stone floor stopped in the imperial study. The emperor's gaze suddenly became complicated. Eunuch Yao's trembling voice rang out in the royal study. It was not that the head of the eunuchs had purposely used such a terrified voice to express the importance he attached to the figure in the wheelchair. Inside and outside the royal study, the coldness that the Qing emperor naturally gave off with his great grandmaster realm had already controlled the hearts of most people. The door to the royal study opened. A few eunuchs carefully and fearfully carried the black wheelchair in. Then, led by Eunuch Yao, they left as quickly as they could. This group of internal court eunuchs left the royal study very, very far away. They walked all the way to where the royal study went around the stone-arched garden gate and led directly to Taiji Palace. Eunuch Yao wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and glanced at Commander Yi and Scholar He waiting outside the garden gate. He didn't say anything. There wasn't even a hint of expression. Yi Zhong's expression was heavy. He only sighed in his heart. After these top figures of the Qing kingdom escorted the black carriage into the royal study, they all consciously hid far away. They knew that under the emperor's cold envelopment, he would not want anyone to hear every word he said to the person in the wheelchair. Old Director Qin returned safely and gently. Although they were not used to such an easy resolution, although they knew old Director Qin was not a simple and terrifying person, including Yi Chong and Eunuch Yao, they were not worried that anything alarming would happen in the royal study. The emperor was a great grandmaster. After Dong Mountain, no one in the world would be able to harm him. The royal study's doors were tightly shut, cutting off all the air, sound, light, smell and autumn outside. Only the emperor, who was sitting ramrod straight on the couch, and Qin Pingping, who was casually sitting in a wheelchair, remained. The two of them hid in the little building, cutting off the storms of the Qin kingdom outside. The storms of the Qin kingdom these decades had been stirred up by these two powerful people. The Qin emperor looked calmly at the old man in the wheelchair for an indeterminable amount of time. It was only when the wrinkles on Qin Pingping's face were like chrysanthemums under the hanging temple that he faintly said, "He Zhongwei is secretly investigating Gao and wants to defeat Fan Xian. I knew of this long ago. The internal court sent 3 people over. When you passed by Dazhou a few days ago, He Qigan should have been there. Did you see him? If there was someone else present and saw this scene, they would certainly be shocked." The emperor had mobilized so many people. All of the important yamens in Jingdou were on standby. The icy young master of the Overwatch Council had also begun to carry out the emperor's edict and began internal pressure. Only then did he manage to invite the old cripple in the black wheelchair back to Jingdou. Everyone knew that there was no turning point between the ruler and his official. However, the emperor's first words to Qin Pingping were an unremarkable name. Qin Pingping was not surprised. He understood his emperor too well. He smiled slightly and said in a slightly sharp and raspy voice, "When I was sent to King Cheng's manor, He Qigan was still young. I saw him once outside Dazhou. Presumably he doesn't remember me at all." "That's not strange. The name Qin Wuchang has disappeared from the royal palace for a long time." The emperor nodded. The sleeve of his dragon robe flew up. A cup of tea slowly left the table and flew in front of Qin Pingping. Qin Pingping accepted it and respectfully nodded his head in greeting. Holding the scalding hot teacup, he sighed comfortably and said, "It's best to drink tea hot." The emperor used his fingers to pick up his icy cold teacup and took a small sip. Calmly he said, "When people leave, the tea gets cold. Otherwise, how could He Qigan not recognize you?" Qin Pingping shook his head and said, "Other than Hong Xixiang, not many people knew that I had once stayed in the palace." The emperor's eyelids lowered slightly and revealed a glimmer of mockery. "Later you even made a fake beard and stuck it to your chin. Of course, you didn't want others to know that you were a eunuch." Qin Pingping's expression did not change. He lowered his head slightly and lightly said, "It was only many years later that I understood that I had always been a eunuch. There was no need to hide it from the world." "But, in the end, you still managed to hide it from the world." The emperor placed the cold teacup on the table and stared into Qin Pingping's eyes. "Back then, you were sent to the manor by the palace to monitor father's movements. However, not even the palace thought that you would secretly reveal your identity to me and be willing to help my manor rise up. In the end, even old eunuch Hong in the palace was persuaded by you to stand on father's side. That was all because of you. Thus, the identity of a permanent eunuch in the palace back then was a great service to you, me, and the Qin kingdom. Why do you always keep this matter in mind? The reason the previous emperor was able to ascend to the throne had little to do with me." Qin Pingping called himself a servant. Unlike in the past, there was not much sense of inferiority in this servant. He only followed the past and said it naturally. He slowly raised his head and looked directly into the Qing emperor's cold eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "That was because someone killed 2 princes. That was why it was King Cheng's turn to sit on the throne and why it was possible for your majesty to have the vast territory you have today." The emperor's gaze suddenly became sharp. It was clear that he did not want to hear anything related to this matter. "But why did you betray the nobles in the palace and throw yourself into the manor to be loyal to me?" he asked. Qin Pingping gazed at the Qing emperor with a not quite there smile like he was looking at a great joke. After a long time he slowly said, "Your Majesty, at that time, you were still a young man. Your nature was clear and broad. You treated people sincerely and your subordinates well. However, I was born with a strange personality. As long as someone treated me well, I would treat them well." The emperor fell silent. He sat ramrod straight on the soft couch as if he was still savoring Qin Pingping's words. His sharp gaze became like the long day at the beginning of autumn. Gradually he revealed his cool side. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. Mockingly he said, "So, you still know that I treated you well." Back then the old prince didn't have any status in the court and didn't have any support in the court. Prince Cheng's manor wasn't big and unremarkable. I was actually the most useless little eunuch in the palace, so I was sent to the prince's manor. For someone as powerful as Hong Xiang, of course, he was always at the side of the nobles in the palace. Qin Pingping seemed to be thinking of many things of the past. He slowly sighed and said, "However, being small has its advantages. Simple has its advantages. At that time there were 3 big boys and 1 little boy. They did their best. Mother Fan would occasionally yell at them from the side, but no one seemed to think it was bad. At that time King Jing was still young. No one wanted to pay attention to him. The emperor raised an eyebrow and said, "Even if Fan Jian and him joined forces to attack me, in the end they were still stopped by you. When the two of us joined forces, no one has ever been a match for us. It is still the same today." After these words left his mouth, Qin Pingping and the emperor fell silent at the same time. After a long time, Qin Pingping gently touched the armrest of the wheelchair and sighed. "After all, Fan Jian was your Majesty's milk brother. In the end I am only a servant. At the time I didn't think much. I just wanted to protect you." The lines of the Qing emperor's face gradually softened, but his gaze drifted into the distance. It was as if it had drifted to the scene of ruler and official holding hands without any disloyalty. Faintly he said, "I have to admit, during those years, you protected me many times. If it wasn't for you, I don't know how many times I would have died." After saying that, the corner of his eye suddenly caught a glimpse of the dossiers on the table. His eyes paused for a moment and he gently took out the first one. He slowly opened it and read through the contents of the dossiers, including his sister, his son, and many other things. At the beginning of the Qing Kingdom's expansion, it did not disturb the Wei Kingdom's iron riders, so you and I were both careless and spied on the Qin Kingdom, which is now Yanjing's defenses. We were surrounded at Ding Mountain by Zhan Qingfeng's foremost killing general, Hu Yu. That person's archery skills were very good. The Qing emperor sighed. After all these years, the only person better than Hu Yu's archery skills is Xiaoyi. When he spoke of northern governor Yan Xiaoyi, who had once betrayed him, there was not a glimmer of hatred or anger in the Qing emperor's tone. There was only pity. The Qing emperor was a person who cherished talent and was extremely confident. He did not fear Yan Xiaoyi at all, which was why he showed such emotions. However, looking at the arrangements he had made for the Overwatch Council these days, in his heart, Qin Pingping was a person who far surpassed any other official. He turned his head and looked at Qin Pingping in the wheelchair. "That day, if you had not sacrificed yourself to block Hu Yu's arrow, perhaps I would have died on the spot." Qin Pingping calmly replied, "This is my duty as a servant." The Qing emperor smiled self-mockingly and glanced at the file in his hand. On it was written that during the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, Qin Pingping had secretly allowed the eldest princess to lead troops into Jingdo and successfully besiege the royal palace. Although the Overwatch Council's actions were meticulous and there was not much evidence on this file, given the emperor's eyesight, he could clearly see the great evil hidden within. He casually tossed the file to the side and ignored it. Then he picked up another one. He squinted his eyes and read it again. He said, "At the floating temple, why did you want to have the shadow assassinate you?" Earlier, it had been a gentle wind and drizzling rain reminiscing about the past. Now an accusatory voice suddenly rang out in the royal study. A faint stench of blood gradually filled the air. However, Qin Pingping seemed to know nothing. Respectfully he replied, "I wanted to see just what your Majesty's final trump card was." "You wanted to see my trump card?" The emperor's gaze stared at the wrinkles on Qin Pingping's face. After a long silence, he calmly said, "Looks like wanting me to die is something you've thought about for a long time." Qin Pingping did not open his mouth to reply. He only smiled warmly and silently admitted to this great crime. "Is the shadow really Sigu Jian's younger brother?" the Qing emperor asked. "Your Majesty's gaze is divine. That day, you guessed the shadow's true background in one gulp. I truly admire you." Qin Pingping said he admired him, but he didn't know if he truly admired him in his heart. The Qing emperor closed his eyes and thought for a bit. He then tossed the file to the side and said, "During the first northern expedition, just as I was breaking through, I suddenly went berserk and was trapped by Zhan Qingfeng's army in the mountains. I was already at the end of my rope. If you had not led the Black Knights and risked your life to save me and exchanged your body for mine along the way, I would probably have died 8 or 10 times over." Qin Pingping's gaze followed the Qing emperor's hand movements. He watched as he tossed the file regarding the truth of the Hanging Temple assassination to the side. The smile in his eyes grew larger and larger until it withered. It was incomparably lonely. There was also a glimmer of mockery in the loneliness. "Your Majesty, don't keep calculating like this. To use the merit of saving the emperor in exchange for a great crime of deceiving or assassinating the emperor, regardless of whether it is from the perspective of Qing law or council regulations, I have taken a great advantage." Qin Pingping's expression calmed. He looked at the emperor and coldly said, "During these decades, I cannot remember how many times I have saved your Majesty. I have never had the extravagant hope of using these merits to offset my own death sentence. Using a great merit to exchange for a great crime. Qin Pingping narrowed his eyes and said lightly and mockingly, "That was the little eunuch in the story she once told. However, I am not that little eunuch. Your Majesty is also not that foreign emperor. Why waste so much time?" "You think I am wasting time?" The emperor's voice became icy, but his gaze burned. He stared at Qin Pingping like he was staring at a dead person. "In the hearts of the people, you are an old black dog at my side. After raising a dog for a long time, one also has feelings. Of course, your Majesty has feelings for me. These years, the honor and power you have given me is no longer something a normal official can enjoy." Qin Pingping leaned slightly against the wheelchair and gazed coldly back at the emperor. Enunciating each word, he said, "However, for you to say such things at this time, it is probably because you want to find a good reason for killing a dog to comfort your own feelings. Did you not deserve to be killed?" The Qing emperor's anger made him laugh. He threw his head back and laughed loudly. The laughter passed out of the royal study and charged straight into the silent royal palace. There was a rare anger in the laughter. He turned and grabbed the files on the table and threw them fiercely at Qin Pingping. The files of different thickness landed on Qin Pingping's body and the wheelchair, making slapping sounds. The Qing emperor's gaze became very deep and cold. He stared at Qin Pingping's face and said each word clearly, "You want to kill me and you also want to kill my son. How despicable of you to force me to kill my own son. Do you, a shameless eunuch, not deserve to be killed?" Qin Pingping slowly brushed away the pages on his body with a slight smile and a glimmer of pleasure as he admired the rare loss of composure the most powerful ruler in the world had in his life. This was probably one of his greatest wishes on this trip back to the capital. The dark desire for revenge that had been entangled at the bottom of his heart for decades, as well as the indescribable disappointment and sadness towards His Majesty, gathered together, causing the old cripple's state of mind to become so complicated. "Your Majesty, if you didn't want to kill your own son, how could I force you to do these things?" Qin Pingping looked at the emperor and faintly said, "When all is said and done, I only want to kill your Majesty. As for the people of the Li royal family in the palace, I only want them to accompany you in death." The emperor calmed down and became cold. He shook off his rare anger. A supreme being in the mortal world, a great grandmaster of martial arts, had revealed such a mortal side in front of Qin Pingping. It could only be said that the decades of interaction and trust between ruler and official had long become a spiritual need that the Qing emperor could not shake off. This spiritual need suddenly became an illusion in an instant. Furthermore, behind the illusion hid the poison of betrayal. Even he found it difficult to endure the impact of such emotions. He looked coldly at Qin Pingping and said, "What I am most angry about is not that you want to kill me or all of my sons. What I am most angry about is that since you have already left Jingdo, why did you still come back? Even in such a situation I still left you a way out. As long as you are willing to leave, I will not keep you." The emperor looked at him coldly. His deep eyes were like an angry old man from ancient times. There was boundless power in the calmness. "If I really wanted to kill you in one move, I would do it myself. I would not have those useless soldiers do this work. However, why did you come back? Why must you force me to personally kill you?" This was a wondrous and strange sentence. The major figures outside the royal study, including General Shifei who had already returned to the garrison camp, could not guess the emperor's intentions. They did not know that the so-called change in Dazhou was still a test of the emperor and Qin Pingping's intentions regarding the last bit of trust between the emperor and Qin Pingping, the ruler and official. In the entire world, probably only Qin Pingping could understand. If he had left with the Black Knights in Dingzhou, it meant that he felt guilty toward the emperor and was unable to face him. However, he did not leave. He returned to Jingdo and gazed coldly and fearlessly at the emperor's face. His heart was open and clear of guilt as he forced the emperor to kill the most loyal official in the history of the Qin kingdom. After a long time, Qin Pingping's eyes were like knives as he stared at the emperor and asked, "Back then, did you give her any way out?" "I returned to the capital to ask the emperor one thing. Why did you kill her?" Chapter 694. The sky was gray and the palace was dark. Not long after the sun rose above the horizon, it did not have time to spread its warm light over the land of the Qin kingdom. It had already been swallowed up by a dark cloud that had appeared out of nowhere. The red light immediately dimmed and the sky grew darker. In the rear palace, serving girls who had woken up to wash in the morning began to boil water. The eunuchs who did chores began to sweep the dust off the ground with bamboo brooms taller than themselves. No one knew what was happening in the front of the royal palace. Like the common people, they repeated their missions and lives day after day. The nobles were no exception. Although the strange situation in Jingdo had faintly entered their ears, the matter was limited to a very limited number of people in the Qing kingdom. Thus no one knew what had happened. At the gate of the garden, the important figures gazing at the royal study from afar were naturally one of the people who knew about this matter. However, their eyes were sunken and their expressions were solemn. They were as wooden as clay statues and did not react at all. Old Director Qin had been in the royal study for a long time, but there was still no movement. Because everyone was far away, they did not hear the emperor's rare angry roar. Perhaps Yi Zhong and Eunuch Yao had this kind of power, but they would not be stupid enough to gather their power and eavesdrop on the sounds in the royal study. As for those things, it would be better if they could hear as little as possible. Qin Pingping wanted to hear a reason and an explanation. Thus he returned to Jingdo and sat coldly in the black wheelchair. Calmly he looked at the master he had served for decades, the Qing emperor. He wanted to hear from his mouth exactly what had happened in the past. When a person was about to die, what they clung to was nothing more than the most infuriating and inexplicable mysteries of their lives. However, the Qing emperor did not reply. He only looked calmly at Qin Pingping. Ever since he heard Qin Pingping's words, he had maintained his standing posture. He looked at him coldly and mockingly for a long time. The sharp light in his eyes gradually turned into a faint mockery, as well as a great deal of confusion. The corners of his eyes narrowed slightly, like a lion watching a wandering spirit pass by its own kingdom, trying to pull up the branches of a solid tree in vain to announce something to itself. The Qing emperor smiled strangely. Tilting his head slightly, he pressed his lips together tightly. Looking at Qin Pingping, he said faintly, "It's actually because of this, because of this." The emperor did not understand. He looked at Qin Pingping as if he was looking at a monster. After a long silence, he shook his head and sighed speechlessly. Only now did he finally understand why this old black dog who had followed him since he was young, would betray him and return to the capital to question him, even at the cost of his life. The Qing emperor knew very well how much his companions liked that woman. However, no matter what he thought, he would never have thought that Qin Pingping would feel a powerful desire for revenge and stand against him because of a woman who had died many years ago. He sat back on the soft couch and was silent for a long time with his hands on his knees. Qin Pingping's hands rested on the arms of the black wheelchair as he looked at him silently and coldly. He didn't say a word, only waiting for the answer. The Qing emperor's face was slightly pale. After a long time he quietly said, "For her, you betrayed me?" The meaning contained in these words was disappointment and sorrow, as well as anger and irritation that came from the depths of his heart. "I just want to know why." Qin Pingping sighed and said, "In my life, I have never seen a woman like her again. No, I have never seen a person like her again. She descended into this mortal world like a fairy and did her best to change what she should change and save what she thought she should save. She helped you, saved me, saved the Qing kingdom and made the world beautiful. Yet you destroyed her." There were no exclamation marks or anger in these words. There was only a wave of vicissitudes and sorrow. The Qing emperor was silent for a long time. His hands slowly rubbed against his knees. In this life, no one had ever asked him this question. More accurately, no one dared to ask him this question. Not many people knew about this question. However, those who knew about this question had all become wandering spirits in the yellow earth. None of his closest companions knew about this matter. "I didn't kill her." The Qing emperor narrowed his eyes. Facing the old dog in front of him, he originally didn't need to explain anything. For some reason, there was a glimmer of pain in the depths of his heart. A glimmer of pain that he had forcefully suppressed for over 20 years slowly seeped out and took over his body and mind. He wanted the most powerful man in the world to explain something. Perhaps he wanted to explain it to Qin Pingping. Perhaps he wanted to explain it to the yellow-clothed woman in the portrait in the little building in the rear palace. Perhaps the emperor only wanted to explain it to himself. "I didn't kill her." The emperor's voice rose slightly. His tone became firmer and colder as he repeated it to Qin Pingping with narrowed eyes. "You didn't kill her?" The wrinkles at the corners of Qin Pingping's eyes were so deep that they almost covered his eyes. He raised his head tiredly and looked at the emperor. Using an extremely cold laugh, he asked, "Then how did she die?" Don't talk about not returning from the Western expedition, don't talk about nobles rebelling, and don't talk about fate. Coincidentally at that time Fan Jian, Wu Zhu, Yizhong, everyone was not in Jingdo. Coincidentally she had just given birth and was at her weakest. Chen Pingping's gaze was like two knives stabbing into the emperor's face. Coldly he said, "Your Majesty rules the world with filial piety. It is best not to push all these crimes onto the Empress Dowager's body. That idiot Empress and her family have already carried the blame for you for 20 years. Do you want your own mother to continue carrying the blame? The Western expedition to the grasslands was your order." At the time, Fan Jian was only the treasurer of Taichung Temple and vice minister of the Ministry of Revenue. He was responsible for all military supplies. Why was he also moved by you to follow the army in the king's tent? Chen Pingping's eyes narrowed tightly. Endless coldness seeped out from his sparse and old eyelashes. Based on our methods in the past, military supplies and logistics were always given to Fan Jian to handle. When the Iron Riders of the Qin Kingdom went on expeditions, he usually stayed in the capital to handle everything. Why did you insist on having Fan Jian follow you into the Western expedition? What are you afraid of? You're afraid that if Fan Jian stayed in the capital, the tiger guards he secretly trained would ruin Qin Ye's plans? A cold smile rose to the corners of Chen Pingping's lips. Yes, you're bringing up the old man of the Qin family again. Who would have thought that this veteran of 3 dynasties was the killer move you left in Jingdo? Yi Zhong, who was then the Jingdo garrison commander, was also urgently summoned to Dingzhou. All of Jingdo is under the Qin family's control. Even if the empress wants to rebel and break into Taiping courtyard, if Qin Yi doesn't nod his head, who can do it? 3 years ago when Jingdo rebelled and Qin Yi jumped out, were you happy? You finally had a chance and an excuse to get rid of the only person who knew of your role in the Taiping courtyard murder case and silence him? Chen Pingping said coldly to the emperor. Of course you disdained killing people to silence them. Even if the Qin family said anything you wouldn't care. However, Fan Xian had grown up. You had no choice but to accept that your son with him was the most talented of all your children. The longer you spent time with him, the more you valued Fan Xian. You also didn't want him to know that his birth mother had died to your hands. So how could Qin Yi not die? Chen Pingping's slightly sharp and raspy voice rang out endlessly in the royal study. The emperor didn't speak. He only listened coldly and calmly. Listening to each word, his expression became slightly strange. There seemed to be a faint sorrow, but there was also a faint relief. Let's go back to Taiping courtyard 22 years ago. Chen Pingping spoke in a bit of a rush. These words were probably the words and deductions this old cripple had secretly held back for decades. Now he finally had the opportunity to say it all in one go in front of the emperor. He coughed loudly until 2 unhealthy patches of red rose on his face. After a long time he finally calmed down and sighed. Let's talk about me. At the time, since you had already decided to act against Taiping courtyard, you would not allow me to remain in Jingdo. Thus, the entire defense line in the north suddenly became tense. Occasionally, there would be news that the country in the north was about to attack the south with full force. As the director of the Overwatch Council and the chief military strategist, and you were busy with the Western expedition, I could only go north on behalf of the emperor and personally investigate the situation. Now that I think about it, to have the entire military system cooperate with this performance and even mobilize the power of a foreign country, other than your majesty's will, who could do it? Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes and said, however, I've always had a question in my heart. To be able to make the newly established Northern Qi court cooperate with the emperor's intentions, could it be that you and Ku He are secretly colluding? Of course Ku He is already dead. I have no one to ask. Chen Pingping shook his head. I did not look for Ku He. At this point in Chen Pingping's accusation, the Qing emperor finally opened his mouth coldly and said his first words. I did not need to look for anyone, nor did I look for anyone. Chen Pingping looked at him with a pitiful and disdainful gaze. Finally, speaking of Wu Zhu, he was the person least likely to leave her side. Yet at the time he left Jingdo. Without question, this is the thing I have been unable to understand the most these years. As long as Wu Zhu was at her side, no matter who in the world, it would probably be difficult to kill her. The Qing emperor's brows jumped slightly, but he still maintained his silence. Your Majesty, I've always been suspicious of you, and I've even been suspicious of Fan Jian. I still don't know which of my companions did this. The corners of Chen Pingping's lips fell. In a slow voice he said, it was not until many years later that Wu Zhu told me that he met a person in a small alley outside Fan Manor. He killed that person and was heavily injured himself. Only then did I understand one thing. There are too few people in this world who can injure Wu Zhu, other than the 4 great grandmasters. Qin Pingping said calmly. Thus, I determined that another emissary from the temple has come to the world. Since the people from the temple could come at that time, then 22 years ago they could also have come. You and I both know that only the people from the temple could make Wu Zhu so wary, to the point that he would leave her side and make sure the people from the temple did not get close to her. The assassination outside the Fan Manor by the people from the temple targeted Fan Xian, but the person they injured was Wu Zhu. That was because you always wanted to know where Wu Zhu was, Qin Pingping said. The first time the people from the temple appeared, they targeted her, but the person they moved away was still Wu Zhu. Wu Zhu seemed to be a wall that only the temple could move and move. Qin Pingping suddenly smiled. Although it only happened twice, both times were too coincidental. They both appeared at times when you had a motive. Your Majesty, I know you've always been afraid of Lao Wu. Qin Pingping's gaze became indifferent as he gazed calmly at the Qing Emperor. Ever since Fan Xian entered the capital, you've always wanted to know Wu Zhu's true whereabouts. Fortunately, Fan Xian has always kept it from me, so you also don't know. Why are you so afraid of Lao Wu? The corners of Qin Pingping's lips twitched as he smiled mockingly. You're afraid that Lao Wu will find out about what happened back then and bring that metal rod to the royal palace to kill you? As the emperor, are there still people you're afraid of? The emperor suddenly smiled and shook his head. No, it is just that someone like Lao Wu should not exist in this world. He should return to where he came from. Perhaps you still don't know, but when Enji was in Danzhou, I asked Uncle Luyun to visit Lao Wu once. As long as Lao Wu had not completely woken up, he was of no threat to me. This is what you've always thought. A monster like a great grandmaster should not exist in this world, Qin Pingping said coldly. That is why I am curious. Why are you still alive? Why don't you just kill yourself? These words were very vicious, but the emperor's expression did not tremble at all. Perhaps those emotions were brewing in his heart, but they still did not explode. Qin Pingping did not show any fear. He continued to speak coldly. Back then, you moved away all of our people and provoked that idiot empress to go crazy. Then, you had Qin Yi watch and control from the side. That was how the murder in Taiping Courtyard happened. Although it looked simple, it was actually incomparably difficult. If one of the links had gone wrong, perhaps she would still not have died. A simple and powerful plan without any flaws. In this world, probably only you, Your Majesty, can weave it. Qin Pingping gently stroked the smooth armrest of the wheelchair inside. Particularly regarding the matter of the people from the temple, I still do not understand why the temple would act according to your plan. Perhaps it was because your goal was always the same. You all wanted her, a person who stood proudly in the world, to be silently wiped out. Qin Pingping looked at the Qing Emperor mockingly. The Qing Emperor was silent for a long time and did not refute this reasoning. He only smiled warmly and said, You old dog, you've spent your entire life thinking about how to harm people. It is not difficult to think clearly about these things. I just never thought you would keep this matter on your mind. However, he said with a heavier tone, I did not kill her. Yes, you did not kill her. Qin Pingping smiled strangely. Of course, our great emperor would not personally kill the woman who gave the Qing kingdom a new lease of life. Of course, you would not kill the benefactor who helped the Li family sit on the throne. Of course, you would not kill the woman you loved the most. Of course, you would not kill your son's birth mother. Blood is difficult to wash away. Of course, you would not let blood flow onto your own hands. Qin Pingping's brows were furrowed tightly. His voice forced out from the depths of his chest with a threatening coldness. Your hands are still pure white. You will always be incomparably bright and correct. The ones with blood on your hands are only those stupid or ruthless people under the throne. We avenged her and wiped out all of the stubborn nobles in the Qing kingdom. How much blood was shed in Jingdo that night? That night, all of the Empress and Empress Dowager's family were killed. Did you smile happily? Qin Pingping asked faintly. All of the light poured into your body. All of the darkness and shamelessness returned to your officials and family. There is nothing more beautiful in the world. Of course you didn't kill her. Qin Pingping pressed his lips together. As he coughed softly, he slowly said, Because you have never moved a finger. Especially after the death of the Qin family, no one in the world knows what happened in the darkness back then. No one has evidence to say that your Majesty personally controlled the Taiping Courtyard murder case. However, the old cripple in the black wheelchair shook his head with slight mockery. You will never be able to convince yourself or me. You will also not be able to change this reality. 22 years ago you personally killed her. You killed a A lonely woman who had just given birth to your son and was at the weakest moment of her life. The most despicable and shameless thing in the world is nothing more than this. After Qin Pingping said the last sentence, his whole body seemed to be exhausted. He leaned against the black wheelchair and slowly closed his eyes. The emperor also slowly closed his eyes. His usually calm face appeared slightly pale. After a long silence, he quietly said, "Correct, I killed her." After that, he opened his eyes, and they were filled with calmness and solemnity as he said, "So what?" After writing the last 4 words, I suddenly felt very cold. I don't know if it's because of the attack of the cold wave. Writing to this point, I won't write today even if you beat me to death. Recently, I've been writing about emotions, so I have to control the emotions and plot within a certain rhythm. The last conversation between the emperor and Qin Pingping in the royal study was a very important process. I have to write carefully. I won't jump scenes like Dong Mountain. Some readers are worried and smile and say, "Don't worry, I have to finish this before it's Fan Xian's turn." I will let everyone know that starting tomorrow, I will still update every day. However, I don't want to make the update time so fixed. This way I can write more freely. I don't want to always feel rushed at 5 or 6 in the afternoon. I'm afraid the more I write, the rougher it becomes. Chapter 695. So what? It was just 4 words. However, after they came from the emperor's thin and emotionless lips, it seemed to add layer after layer of frost to the royal study. A boundless and endless coldness appeared out of nowhere and froze all of the glass windows, mahogany tables, and green potted plants in the room. It was as if there was a white frost invisible to the naked eye spreading across these things and then spreading out, enveloping the entire cold royal palace and turning the cold into ice. The coldness even pierced into the sky, attacking the balls of gray clouds in the distant eastern horizon. The cloud was like a frightened little animal. Stimulated by this chill, its entire body rapidly shrunk and shivered. Its color gradually darkened, and it had no choice but to squeeze out some of the moisture that was deeply hidden in the clouds. The wetness condensed into water and rain, slowly falling from the sky. In the gray Jingdo and royal palace, everyone who had already woken narrowed their eyes and looked at the cloud in the sky. Only now did they know that the first rain of early autumn had finally fallen. The weather was about to turn cold. However, the coldness on the Qing Emperor's body did not oppress the heavens and the earth. There was not a single gap. The color of his thin lips was not very pretty, but there was still a sliver of leeway in his heart. Qin Pingping sat in his wheelchair and looked calmly at the master he had served for decades, waiting for his next words. If the Qing Emperor had never felt a sliver of guilt for what happened in the past, if there was not a sliver of hidden pain in the depths of his heart, and if his heartless nature was truly at its extreme, then he would be the person with the least flaws in the world. Regardless of who stood in front of this emperor, they would involuntarily feel a sense of submission and retreat in defeat. They would not look at him coldly like Qin Pingping. The corners of Qin Pingping's eyes drooped. If the emperor's heart was truly as cold as 1,000-year-old ice, then why did he need to say those words? Although they were the coldest words, they were still words. The emperor did not accept that in Qin Pingping's heart, he could not compare to Yi Qingmei. That was why he was truly angry. For you, Yi Qingmei is still not a passerby. Qin Pingping sighed faintly. His eyes flashed past the emperor's shoulder and looked at the wall behind the royal study. It was as if he wanted to look through the wall until he saw a certain portrait. His Majesty smiled. His smile was light, cold, self-deprecating, painful, and complicated. After a long silence he said, "I don't want to talk about the past." "Why not?" Qin Pingping narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "Do you feel that she is too dazzling and has completely overshadowed your Majesty's pride, so you have always felt uncomfortable in your heart?" The emperor smiled mockingly and did not explain anything. He only said, "Xiao Yezi has never been someone who likes to show his face in public. So you also know." Qin Pingping cackled. There was a trace of resentment in his hoarse voice. "What on earth can't you tolerate?" "I can't tolerate it, or this world can't tolerate it." The emperor slowly raised his head and looked straight into Qin Pingping's eyes. Coldly and solemnly he said, "Perhaps you people have never thought of this question." His cold voice came to an abrupt end. It was clear that the Qing Emperor did not want to talk about anything related to the past. Even when faced with a companion who had accompanied him for decades, even in such a situation, he still valiantly held on to the piece of underworld in his heart and did not want to touch it. However, Qin Pingping had returned to the capital to meet his death in order to tear open the veil that had isolated this middle-aged man for thousands of years in this seemingly undefeatable man's heart. He wanted to reveal the wound that might exist in his heart. Only then could he weaken him. Qin Pingping stared into the Qing Emperor's eyes and said, "Was it the Empress Dowager's great displeasure, the powerful backlash of the nobility, or your pride that made you make such a cold-blooded and heartless decision?" The Qing Emperor's face was indifferent. He did not answer his question, but his eyes gradually grew empty. Their focus drifted somewhere. Coldly he changed the topic. "Then what made you make such a treasonous decision? You are a eunuch. Do you like women?" "A eunuch?" Qin Pingping slowly lowered his eyelids. "I said earlier that I would be good to whoever was good to me. I have always remembered her kindness to me. Her death was tragic. Presumably it was also puzzling. I have waited these decades to ask you on her behalf. Did I not treat you well?" The Qing Emperor's gaze gently swept across Qin Pingping's old face. Faintly he said, "I have bestowed upon you supreme glory. I have bestowed upon you a position that normal officials would never have. I have bestowed upon you trust. Yet you have come to ask me because of a woman who has been dead for 20 years? Qin Pingping gazed at the Emperor with a not-quite-there smile and suddenly said, "She treated me well like a friend. Your Majesty treated me well like a servant. How can they be the same?" The Emperor waved his hand tiredly. He didn't want to talk about this question that had no answer. The encounters in one's life were always wondrous, particularly with the Qing kingdom's former companions. The entanglements between them probably could not be explained even if they talked for 3 days and 3 nights. Qin Pingping continued, "I was only a eunuch in King Cheng's manor, but she never showed any disdain for me because of my crippled body. She treated me sincerely and as a friend. This is a treatment I have never enjoyed in my life. Not before her and not after her." He suddenly smiled slightly and said, "Fortunately, Fan Xian is more like her." In the quiet royal study, Fan Xian's name was particularly ear-piercing. The Emperor, who had maintained his coldness with a powerful state of mind, furrowed his brows slightly when he heard Fan Xian's name. "I don't want to talk about what Xiao Yezi has done for the Qing kingdom, the Li royal family, and us." Qin Pingping sighed tiredly. There was no need to talk about the past. It was all stored in the hearts and minds of these companions. No one would purposely remember it, but no one would forget it. His voice was slightly sharp as he said, "Yes, when you first ascended to the throne, the court was not stable. You wanted to push through new policies, but the backlash was too great. The Overwatch Council I controlled monitored the governance of officials and also caused some instability in Jingdo. Furthermore, the Empress Dowager was always afraid of that woman who refused to enter the palace, particularly when she discovered that woman's influence on you was far above hers. That stupid empress had just married you and didn't know why you didn't stay in the palace every day and instead went to Taiping Courtyard to climb over the wall. Yi Qingmei has helped you. By the seaside in Danzhou, the picture she once promised has gradually unfolded. The old Yi family has already built 3 workshops in North Min. The foundation of the Qing kingdom has been firmly established. It seems that she no longer has any use for your majesty. On the contrary, she is the most unstable factor in the court. If her picture continues, the Qing kingdom will not be the Qing kingdom it is today. Your majesty, it is impossible for you to allow such a thing to happen. Furthermore, in the process, you may offend all the officials and gentry in the world." Qin Pingping's eyes narrowed slightly and he said with slight mockery, "If you want to achieve something extraordinary, you need to have extraordinary boldness, but you don't have this boldness. You also don't want to give up everything you already have. As long as Yi Qingmei dies, you can enjoy everything she has given you but don't need to bear any of the dangers she brings. 1,000 reasons, 10,000 reasons, even if you have countless reasons to kill her because of this throne, this country, and your own ambition." Qin Pingping pressed his lips together and shook his head disdainfully. "But this person is you. You don't have any right to do this." The Qing Emperor's gaze remained empty. It was as if he had not heard Qin Pingping's questions that pierced straight to his heart. He only slowly said, "There are still words left in King Jing's manor. Presumably you still remember them clearly. Although her strange thoughts that deviated from the human heart were beautiful, they were poisonous flowers. Once they bloomed in the fields of the Qing kingdom, the entire Qing kingdom would probably fall because of them. As the emperor of the Qing kingdom, I have to be responsible for the people. In my life I cherished that woman the most." The emperor turned his head and looked coldly at Qin Pingping. "I cherished that woman more than anyone else in the world. What does that have to do with the people? Your Majesty and I both know what kind of person Xiao Yezi was. She was never someone who had empty thoughts but no strength to put them into practice. The words she said and the words she left behind were perhaps only things she wanted to leave behind. Qin Pingping looked coldly at the emperor. You, on the other hand, were shocked by those terrifying thoughts. Your Majesty, you suddenly realized that her thoughts were too damaging to this throne. Even if she didn't do it now, the fire she left behind might at some point burn this bright but actually rotten chair to ashes. Rotten chair? The emperor smiled strangely and looked at Qin Pingping. I didn't think that you, an old dog, would be such a person. Qin Pingping did not answer. He coughed twice and continued to say weakly, Your Majesty, why do you have to explain so much? Why don't you just say what you said earlier? You are just greedy for this chair. You have too many lofty aspirations, or rather, ambitions that you want to fulfill. How can you allow someone to jeopardize this process? Going back to what happened earlier, you can't forever let a woman vaguely suppress you. Hearing these words, the Qing emperor was silent for a long time. No one knew if this was tacit agreement or if he was thinking about his most obscure inner thoughts back then. After a long time, he coldly said, Did she not give me any ambitions or aspirations? Back then, I was only an unremarkable heir in King Cheng's manor. Although I had lofty aspirations, pitied the people's hardships, and wanted to change everything in the chaos of war, what ability did I have to realize all of this and even dream of all of this? The emperor said with slight mockery. It was her, you, Fan Jian, and everyone else who allowed me to walk step by step to the throne and have all of these dreams and the possibility of realizing all of this. The Qing emperor's gaze sharpened. His voice became steady and loud as he said sternly, Since I have sat on this throne, I will complete my thoughts back then. No matter who it is, do not try to stop all of this. Thoughts back then? Qin Pingping looked at him and coldly said, Your Majesty, do you still remember our thoughts back then? I know what you want to say, old dog. The emperor sat on the soft couch. The sleeves of his dragon robe spread out like clouds. A powerful and solemn aura rose from his entire body like a god among the clouds. In a low voice he said, I wanted to conquer a vast country and unify the entire world so that the billions of people in the 3 countries would no longer have to suffer the pain of war for generations to come. Was this not her wish? The Qing emperor's voice gradually rose. He looked at Qin Pingping with a sinister coldness. It's been a long time since we've had a conversation like today. Only now do I realize that you, old dog, are still a character who bemoans the world. But don't forget, I am the Qing emperor. I don't care at all about the agreement back then or what I once betrayed. But I care about her. I have done everything I promised her. So, regardless of whether it is you or Fan Jian, even if she comes back from the underworld and asks me about my actions these decades, I can look at you disdainfully and say that only I can do all of this. Qin Pingping sank into silence. She is a mysterious woman, but in the end she is a woman. She is very childish. However, I had not thought that you were also childish. The emperor slowly closed his eyes. Only his thin lips opened slightly. His words were full of coldness. Governing a country is not like supporting flowers and weeding out weeds. It is not something that can be accomplished by that useless King Jing complaining about himself every day. As an emperor, in order to achieve a goal, anyone can die. Anyone can die. So she died. Qin Pingping's body was hunched over in his wheelchair. Sorrowfully he said, All of the causes of chaos within the Qing kingdom can die, such as the empress, the eldest princess, the crown prince, and many others. But I don't understand. What is the difference between the Qing kingdom of today and the Qing kingdom of the past? What is the difference between this world and the world 20 years ago? Your Majesty, you say that you are the one chosen by the world. For the sake of your goal, you can sacrifice everything. But if one day it is your turn to be sacrificed, will you be willing to do so? I will certainly be the master of the world, the king of the world, the Qing emperor said coldly. As long as I exist, the world will be better off. It is still an empty title, Qin Pingping sighed. Your Majesty, you are extraordinarily energetic, and your eyes are as bright as torches. The Qing kingdom's governance has never been better. But what will happen after you die? People will always die. Shortly after, the old cripple in the wheelchair waved his hand and lightly said, After you die, even if the flood surges to the heavens, I suddenly think of these words. I suddenly think that this question is unnecessary. Your Majesty, I still overestimated you. In the end, you are just a normal person whose heart and body have been completely taken over by ambition. Regardless of whether you are a great grandmaster or an emperor, you still cannot escape this point. The emperor was not angry. He only looked at him and lightly said, "At least the things I promised her back then have been done one by one." "Is that so? Before I die, can I listen to your Majesty's explanation so that I can die with peace of mind? Just take it as the last grace your Majesty has given me." The emperor noticed the glimmer of mockery at the corners of Qin Pingping's lips. For some reason the emperor's heart suddenly trembled slightly. Boundless anger rose in him. As an emperor, particularly one like him, the thing he could not tolerate the most was being ignored or purposely looked down on the achievements he had made in this land. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Slowly he said, "I don't need to explain anything to a eunuch like you. After I die, I will tell her one thing at a time. Your Majesty, do you have the face to see her after you die?" Today Qin Pingping was completely different from the past. When a person was about to die, his heart was clear, and his aspirations were strong. In front of the most powerful person in the world, he coldly and harshly scraped at his heart. "I heard that by the Danzhou Sea you once explained these so-called things to Fan Xian. Are you trying to comfort yourself, or do you want to use Fan Xian to have her, in the unseen world, forgive you?" These words were light, but they just happened to pierce the Qing Emperor's heart. The Qing Emperor opened his eyes. They were still that strange emptiness, but his face was slightly pale. "Why would I not dare to see her?" The Qing Emperor was silent for a long time. He then suddenly laughed. His laughter echoed through the royal study. "That year by the Danzhou Sea and in King Cheng's old manor, I have already done or will do what I promised her. Everything I have done in my life, are they not things she has once hoped for endlessly?" Qin Pingping only looked at him coldly. The Qing Emperor's voice became low. He coldly said, "She wants to reform and root out the evils of the court. Fine, I will do as she says. I will change the reign, change the system, and carry out new policies. She said that you must listen to advice, so I granted the imperial censorate the right to discuss matters. She said that establishing a postal system within the country is of great benefit to business and the people. Fine, I spared no expense in national funds and used the shortest amount of time to build a postal system throughout the country. She said that the eunuchs in the palace are pitiful and hateful." The Qing Emperor glanced coldly at Qin Pingping. "Thus, I abolished the custom of sending eunuchs to each manor and duke's manor, dispersed half of the eunuchs in the palace, and strictly prohibited eunuchs from interfering in politics. She said that a country cannot be rich without commerce. Thus, I greatly supported the merchants and sent Xue Qing to be permanently stationed in Jiangnan to prevent the court from interfering in the business of the people. She said that the country would not be stable without agriculture. Thus, I put great effort into irrigation and set up a river transport yamen to repair the long river dikes. She said that she wanted newspapers, so I made newspapers. She said that she wanted lace, so I painted lace." The emperor spoke faster and faster. His eyes grew brighter and brighter. In the end he seemed to be moved. Looking at Qin Pingping, he loudly reprimanded, "Whatever she wants, I will do. What right do you have to criticize me?" Qin Pingping smiled. It was a very happy and strange smile. He gazed at the emperor and quietly said, "You said these words very skillfully. Presumably, other than by the Danzhou Sea, you often talk to that portrait in the little building. Are you trying to comfort her in heaven, or are you trying to drive away the coldness in your heart?" The Qing Emperor's expression changed slightly. Qin Pingping slowly straightened his body and looked at him, enunciating each word clearly. Looking at him, he enunciated each word clearly. Carrying out a new policy is not a new policy just by changing the year name a few times. Restructuring is also not changing the Ministry of War to the Ministry of Military Affairs and then changing it to the Bureau of Military Affairs. Your Majesty, do you remember what the Imperial College was called in the beginning? Do you remember that there was once a yamen called the Institute of Education? The Tungwen Pavilion? What is the Transfer Office? What is the Transport Office? The new policy is not a new name. It is a new policy." Qin Pingping's sharp voice was like a whip, striking the emperor's face. "Restructuring is not a change of name. What bullsh *t new policy? Making the officials and people not know what the yamen is called as a new policy? Are you deceiving the people of the world, or are you deceiving yourself? The imperial censorate discussed rumors? In the end, how did it become a lump of mud in the hands of the eldest princess of Xinjiang? Allowing them to discuss without charge? In the autumn of the 5th year of the Qing calendar, the imperial censor of the left surrendered. Those imperial censors wearing brown official robes were cruelly flogged because of Fan Xian. Who gave this order? Not to mention the postal route system. This is a complete joke. Sending a letter costs a tale of silver. Other than the children of officials who can afford it. Other than feeding a large group of lazy relatives of officials in the courier stations, what use is this postal route? Strictly forbidding eunuchs from interfering in politics? Who the hell was Hong Xiang? An assassin entered the palace and involves court and national affairs. He is a commander eunuch, yet he has the authority to lead the investigation. Fine, even if his identity is special, then let me ask your majesty. When eunuch Yao goes out, a large group of second and third level officials have to bow and make way. What does this mean? The court greatly supports the merchants? The court does not interfere with the business of the people? Qin Pingping's voice grew sharper and sharper. With disdain he said, how can the Ming family have so many shares of the nobility? If your majesty does not interfere with business, what did Fan Xian go to Jiangnan to do? Right now, the merchants are nothing more than a flock of fat sheep raised by the court. Building irrigation works and ensuring agriculture? Qin Pingping's smile became more and more out of tune. Haha, the river transport governor's yamen is the blackest yamen in the world. I wanted to investigate many years ago, but your majesty, you have the heart of an emperor. You know that this yamen hides the connections of half the world's officials. You don't want to shake the court, so you can only allow it to rot. What happened in the end? When the river broke its banks, how many people drowned? How many people froze to death in the winter between the 5th and 6th years of the Qing calendar? Even if Fan Xian and his wife desperately stuffed silver into it these 2 years, they could only keep it going. There's also that troublesome newspaper and lace. The corners of Qin Pingping's eyes narrowed as he looked mockingly at the Qing emperor. The newspaper she spoke of is something to open the people's minds, not some useless dog shit from the internal court. It shouldn't just have the story of me, an old dog. There should be other contents. Your Majesty, do you think I'm right? The emperor's face grew paler and paler until it was almost transparent. He did not hear Qin Pingping's last words at all. Perhaps you can convince Fan Xian and yourself that during these years, you have worked hard to do something for the Danzhou seaside in King Cheng's manor. You have worked hard to make up for something and put into practice something. Qin Pingping looked at the emperor harshly. But you can't convince her in the portrait. It's just that she can't speak now. Your Majesty, you also can't convince me. Unfortunately, I can still speak now. The emperor was silent for a long time. His pale face matched his slightly trembling fingers. One could imagine the extreme anger and hatred in the depths of his heart. He slowly raised his head and looked at Qin Pingping. Coldly he said, the worst thing I did in my life was when I was still the crown prince. I heard her say that the officials of the court needed an independent yamen to supervise them. So, I ignored everyone's opposition and wrote to my father to forcefully establish the Overwatch Council yamen. All the more reason I shouldn't have listened to her and let you, an old dog who can't be raised, a eunuch covered in the stench of urine, become the first director of the Overwatch Council. The Qing Emperor's voice was calm, but there was a boundless coldness in it. Qin Pingping was silent for a long time. He then raised his head and calmly said, even the Overwatch Council that I, an old dog, have guarded with my life for decades, is probably not the Overwatch Council she wants to see. The Emperor listened to the old cripple faintly say, the Overwatch Council is an organization to supervise the officials. It is not the strange and powerful Secret Service organization it is now, particularly when this council is yours. Qin Pingping suddenly smiled awkwardly. His eyes stared straight at the Emperor's face. Do you still remember what was written on the stone tablet in front of the Overwatch Council? It was a line of shining golden characters that forever shone in front of the Overwatch Council's sinister and square building. It attracted the gazes of countless Jingdo people. However, no one would ever see these characters clearly. The officials of the Overwatch Council all memorized them clearly, but they did not know the meaning hidden behind these words. Most importantly, perhaps those people back then knew the full text of these words. Regardless of whether it was the Emperor or anyone else, perhaps they had all unconsciously forgotten this point. In the entire world, only Qin Pingping and the earliest people of the Overwatch Council still remembered these words. I hope that the people of the Qing Kingdom can all become uninhibited people. When being mistreated by others, one must have a heart that will not yield. When being attacked by evil, one must have a heart that will not be frustrated. If there is something wrong, one must not have a heart that is afraid to correct. One must not suck up to wolves and tigers. These were the words Yi Qingmei left for the Overwatch Council. However, she did not finish. There were 2 more lines that, for some reason, disappeared into the dust of history. Qin Pingping gazed indifferently at the emperor. His dry lips trembled slightly. Enunciating each word, he said, "I hope that each of the people of the Qin kingdom can become a king. They can all become the one and only king that rules over the territory they call their own." "Your Majesty, my king." Qin Pingping's gaze carried a burning passion and a stubbornness that he was willing to give everything for. From the beginning, the Overwatch Council was used to monitor you. Chapter 696. The royal study quieted down again. From the darkest moment before dawn to the rising sun leaping out of the earth, to the warm morning light being covered by dark clouds and the patter of autumn rain falling like cotton, the sounds in the royal study were like the weather. Sometimes it was loud and sometimes it was soft. Sometimes it was violent and sometimes it was as quiet as an iceberg. The atmosphere was even more so. Sometimes it was tense and harsh. Sometimes it was silent and iron-blooded. Sometimes it was confused as one remembered the past. Sometimes it was cold as one talked about the past. The Qing Emperor and Qin Pingping had never been a normal ruler and official. The battle between the two of them was very different from a normal battle. Until now, Qin Pingping was only using words. Perhaps it was only the intentions that his words represented. He held up the straw and stabbed it, hoping to prick a bit of blood out of the other party's bare and tender heart and create a fresh wound. An unhealthy paleness lingered for a long time under the Qing Emperor's face and refused to disperse. His eyes were empty. No, it should be said that they were empty. His slightly thin face, paired with his current expression and gaze, appeared particularly cold. No one knew what kind of waves of shock the Qing Emperor was experiencing in his heart. He only looked calmly at Qin Pingping. After a long silence, he slowly said, "What right do you have to monitor me?" He coldly said, "I gave up everything in the world. Do you understand what I am searching for?" This was a kind of disdain an emperor had for the old dog. Qin Pingping's hands rested naturally on the arms of the black wheelchair. He looked at him lightly. There was only coldness and disdain in his eyes. The coldness and disdain the ruler and official had for each other permeated the entire royal study. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how powerful the Qin kingdom is, you still cannot change one reality, the one you are most unwilling to admit. Qin Pingping lowered his eyes slightly and said, "In the end, the power of the Qin kingdom still relies on her legacy. If she had not left behind the palace treasury to endlessly send blood to the court, if she had not left behind the Overwatch Council to help the emperor control the balance in the court, how could you have allowed the Qin kingdom to last until now when the Qin kingdom has fought for years? You want to prove that without her, you can still do your best, even better than when she was alive." Qin Pingping slowly raised his head and said in a hoarse voice, "You want to lift the sky above your head, but in fact, you only prove that you have to rely on her. You are not as good as her." Qin Pingping's calm and natural words pierced the deepest part of the emperor's heart. The emperor suddenly thought of that stormy night 3 years ago. In Guangxin Palace not far behind, he had once personally gripped Li Yunrui's throat and said to his most beautiful sister, "No matter what, you cannot compare to Yi Qingmei." His heart slightly moved and his face slightly paled. His thin and emotionless lips were tightly pressed together as he coldly said, "History is ultimately written by living people. I am alive and she is dead. This is enough. So, Your Majesty, why bother explaining? You just need to admit that you are cold-blooded, heartless, hypocritical, and inferior." A smile appeared on Qin Pingping's face. "That's enough. Is she really a fairy? Untainted by the smoke and fire of the world? Merciful and merciful?" The emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said with slight mockery, "Or is it that in your heart, you only allow yourself to imagine her as such? No, not only you but also Fan Jian, that useless King Jing, and perhaps Ji as well. All of you think I am cold and heartless, yet you impudently used your imaginations to paint too many golden borders on her body. She is not a person, nor is she a fairy, nor is she a god who has come to save the world." The emperor faintly sighed. His brows gradually furrowed tightly. Slowly he said, "She is only you people know, including me in the past. She is only our imaginations. I often wonder if this woman has never appeared. Did we just allow our imaginations to gather together and form this kind of person?" Qin Pingping coldly shook his head. "You know that is not the truth. But it is still an imagination." The emperor's expression became cold. The corners of his lips curled up slightly as he looked at Qin Pingping. "You pieces of trash have put all of the beautiful imaginations of the world into her. Thus she is incomparably bright in your hearts. You can't even find a trace of darkness. Exceptionally intelligent but not scheming. Bemoaning the state of the universe and pitying the fate of mankind, but not a childish woman who doesn't understand the affairs of the world. She is a doer with practical methods. The emperor's eyes were cold as he continued. What kind of person is she? A person without any flaws or flaws. Is such a person still human? He suddenly laughed, a sorrowful and vicious laugh. Unfortunately, there has never been such a person in the world. She is also a mortal, a normal person who has joy, anger, glory, darkness, schemes and schemes. When all is said and done, what difference is there between her and me? Your Majesty. Qin Pingping slowly shook his head. If she really was the kind of person you think she is, how could she have died to your hands? Is that so? The emperor's pupils constricted slightly. He laughed strangely. Ah, everyone becomes their own king? What an arrogant thought. So, the Overwatch Council is monitoring me. Only now do I know that you, old dog, were left behind by her to monitor me. If she didn't suspect me back then, if she didn't guard against me, how could she have left behind such words? Wrong, Your Majesty, Qin Pingping said with a wooden expression. Qin Pingping's expression was wooden as he said, regardless of who sits on the throne, the Overwatch Council will monitor them. This is not evidence that she was wary of you from the beginning and wanted to deal with you. Then what about the tyrannical martial method? For some reason, the emperor's tone suddenly became very dark and deep. Although his voice was slightly higher, it did not make one feel any warmth. His voice was like a sword that had been soaked in the water of the underworld for millions of years, piercing directly into the surroundings of the royal study. The emperor's face did not twist. However, a glimmer of coldness flashed through his empty eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, when she passed on the tyrannical martial method to me, I had thought that she had made such a decision because Northern Qi and Dongyi each had a great grandmaster. I was deeply grateful. With this tyrannical martial method, I led you, Yi Zhong and Wang Jikuan through the battlefields and swept through everything. It was rare for me to be defeated. Who would have thought that behind this so-called supreme martial method, there was an unparalleled evil intent hidden? After the emperor's voice left his anger, it became unusually cold. When I first went on the northern expedition, I sensed that the tyrannical Zhenqi in my body was restless. However, it had to be done. I led the army forward and fought a series of battles with Zhan Qingfeng in the northern mountains. However, it was at this time that the hidden danger exploded. In my body all the meridians were broken. Qin Pingping was silent. He was one of the people who knew this period of history the best. The northern expedition had been difficult. Zhan Qingfeng had been extremely experienced in using troops. The Wei Kingdom's military was particularly strong. The Qin Kingdom had taken the risk of sending tens of thousands of troops to the north. It was truly a choice of death. However, the Wei Kingdom was already rotten. The people had no way of making a living. If they wanted to change the situation and create a new situation and possibility for the future, the Qin Kingdom had to send out troops. At that time, the Qing Emperor, who was the Crown Prince, led the army on the northern expedition. Qin Pingping remained in the newly established Overwatch Council. For one, he had to ensure Jingdo's safety. For another, he had to maintain a distance from the battlefield and ensure that he could make decisions calmly. Coincidentally, the battle was at its most intense. When Zhan Qingfeng led the army to surround the Qing army on the outskirts of Shao Mountain, the commander of the Qing army, the Crown Prince, was suddenly heavily injured. All the meridians in his body were broken. He lay motionless in the military camp. Although Yi Zhong, who was a deputy at the time, and Wang Jikuan, the young officer of the personal soldiers, stood out at the most critical moment, the Qing Kingdom was already at a disadvantage on the battlefield. The commander was suddenly unable to look at the situation. In a flash, Zhan Qingfeng's army advanced. The Qing army was torn apart. The Crown Prince was also trapped in the mountains. It was at that time that Qin Pingping led the Overwatch Council's Black Knights to complete their shocking first thousand-li advance. They forcefully tore a large hole in the net the Wei Kingdom's army had woven. Braving endless risks, they rescued the Crown Prince, who was now the Qing Emperor. There was no need to mention the hardships along the way. The Black Knights were almost completely wiped out before they managed to rescue the Emperor. At that time, Qin Pingping had a question in his heart. Just what kind of strange injury had the Emperor suffered? There were no major wounds on the surface, but the meridians inside were all broken. He had become a cripple. During these years, Qin Pingping had guessed some things. Fan Xian had also once faced the danger of almost having his meridians all broken. He knew where the emperor's strange and terrifying injury came from. Presumably, it was the dangerous juncture that would inevitably appear once the tyrannical martial method reached a certain realm. My body could not move. My eyes could not see. My mouth could not speak. It was as if there were countless sharp little knives inside my body endlessly cutting at my organs, bones, and flesh. The emperor's gaze was empty. Coldly he said, "That kind of pain, hopelessness, loneliness, and darkness is not something you can imagine. My will has always been strong. At that time I couldn't help but think of suicide. However, I couldn't even move a finger. I wanted to die but I couldn't." The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly. He smiled self-mockingly. What a tragic and wretched end. He glanced at Qin Pingping lightly. "That day, if you hadn't risked everything to save me, perhaps I would have died then." Qin Pingping was silent. He did not mock or respond. The emperor's nose twitched slightly. Coldly he took a deep breath. "However, the heavens did not abandon me. After many months of such pain and suffering, I finally woke up. Not only did I wake up, but I also finally broke through the juncture of the tyrannical martial method." The emperor's voice trembled slightly. Decades had passed. When he thought of that terrifying and inhuman torment, his strong heart still couldn't stop shaking. He lowered his head and looked at Qin Pingping with slight mockery. What exactly did she want to do with this fatal martial method? I asked her how to break through the juncture. She said she didn't know. The emperor suddenly laughed. His eyes narrowed slightly. Coldness seeped out from the cracks. She didn't know. She created Ku He, Sigujien, and me. She actually said she didn't know. She wanted to use me as a weakness to make me listen to her and agree to her for the rest of my life. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched strangely. Mockingly he said, "But how could I be such a person? After I passed this juncture of life and death, I have seen everything in this world lightly. I have also finally understood that this dazzling woman in your eyes actually has her cruelest side. Since the heavens do not abandon me, how could I abandon myself?" After hearing the Qing emperor's words, Qin Pingping smiled slightly. After letting out a sigh, he continued to display his restrained smile to its fullest extent. Shaking his head, he laughed hoarsely and said, overly suspicious. Your Majesty, you will probably never be able to escape this in your life." Qin Pingping's laughter was very ancient and sorrowful. He looked calmly at the emperor and said, "Excuses will forever be excuses. Perhaps you thought so back then. However, Fan Xian has also practiced it. If it weren't for Haitang helping him, he would probably also have fallen into that hell-like juncture. She has always had the heart of Tianyi Dao in her hands." The emperor slowly closed his eyes. "But that could forever remain in the 9th-level realm," Qin Pingping said with slight mockery. "Are you willing?" Without waiting for the emperor's reply, he gently waved his hand and sighed. "There is no need to bring up the things of the past. Since you can even doubt her, you can doubt everyone in the world. However, this kind of doubt is a bit too laughable." Since it was laughable, he had to laugh. Qin Pingping laughed. He rocked back and forth in his black wheelchair. Murky tears almost squeezed out from between his old eyes. "I just want you to know before you die that what you remember is just an illusory illusion." The emperor opened his eyes and shook off his memories. Looking at Qin Pingping coldly, he said, "You are my dog, yet you are asking me on her behalf. I want you to know that the mistress you loyally protect is not a pure and untainted fairy." Qin Pingping stopped smiling. His shoulders sank slightly. After a moment of silence, he replied, "I am not a saint who regards the world as my responsibility, nor do I have the right to be a saint. When I criticized you earlier, it was not for the common people in the world, nor was it because I felt any pity for them. It was just that this was her dying wish. Yes, Your Majesty, we have met today not for the common people. It is only a personal grudge." He raised his head and looked calmly at the emperor. "You killed her, so I will avenge her. This is a personal grudge, not some dog's *t righteousness. This is a very simple matter and does not need to carry any other meaning. I don't care at all what kind of person she was. Whether she was a fairy that fell to the mortal world or a little demon girl with other schemes inside, what does that matter? She is called Yi Qingmei. That is enough," Qin Pingping said slowly as he looked at the emperor. The emperor looked at his old comrade in the wheelchair. After a long time he sighed gently. The glimmer of a smile rose to his face. However, this smile represented a deeper meaning. In his eyes, this old dog was already dead. "This is a strange and chaotic emotion," the emperor said coldly. Overseeing the ruler of a country, a eunuch who can't forget a woman. So, you have already gone crazy many years ago. Of course, I must admit that I have been deceived by you for many years. The Overwatch Council is indeed troublesome in your old dog's hands. The entire Overwatch Council only knows of Qin Pingping and does not know of me, the emperor. This is my indulgence of you, but it is also your ability. However, I do not understand. What right do you have to raise the knife of vengeance against me? What ability do you have? The emperor looked at Qin Pingping with faint disdain. He picked up the cup of cold tea he had not drunk in a long time and slowly took a sip. Qin Pingping also picked up the still warm cup of tea from the front of the armrest of the wheelchair and moistened his dry lips. A moment later he quietly replied, "Presumably Yan Bingyun is already organizing the Overwatch Council on your Majesty's behalf." The emperor's gaze looked at the clear yellow tea in the cup. He froze slightly and then returned to normal. "Since I have returned to the capital alone, I do not want the entire Qin kingdom to sink into turmoil because of my vengeance," Qin Pingping said. "Thus, I will not pay attention to Yan Bingyun. You have come to meet your death just to scold me a bit?" A difficult-to-grasp smile rose to the corners of the emperor's lips. "Your Majesty understands me, which is why you have chatted with me for so long when I am destined to die," Qin Pingping said with a slight smile. Qin Pingping smiled and said, "Because you don't know what my final move is, so you must accompany me until I finish saying what I want to say." "I have already said what I want to say. I want to see what cards you have yet to reveal," the emperor smiled warmly. He had long shaken off the earlier wavering of his state of mind and the emotions brought about by the past. He had recovered the appearance of a calm and powerful emperor. Qin Pingping did not reply. He only looked meaningfully at the emperor and suddenly asked another question. "During these 20 years I have already done so many things. Do you still not understand, your Majesty?" The emperor's finger slowly turned his head toward the celadone teacup, but his gaze slowly landed on the ground. On the ground by the feet of the black wheelchair lay a few files. Recorded on them were how Qin Pingping had, step by step, driven all of the emperor's family to stand against him during these years. The fire in Huichun Hall was set by the council. The imperial doctor was killed by someone I sent. The imperial relative also met the same end. As for the medicine the crown prince used, it was Fei Jie who personally made it. Of course, Fei Jie has long left this land. Even if your Majesty wanted to sentence him to death, presumably, you would not be able to. Qin Pingping looked coldly and emotionlessly at the emperor and said each word clearly. The matter of the eldest princess and the crown prince having an affair was something I watched coldly from the side and helped slightly. Then, I did everything I could to let your Majesty know. The emperor's finger that was turning the teacup stopped. That night there was a thunderstorm. Your Majesty must have lost your composure in Guangxin Palace. Although I did not see it with my own eyes, just thinking about it makes me feel comforted. The wrinkles on Qin Pingping's face melted. He appeared very comforted. Your Majesty, why are you so angry about the eldest princess and the crown prince having an affair? Did you always feel that this sister should belong to you? However, due to your self-torturing thoughts of a wise ruler, you could only suppress it? Who knew that the crown prince would do it? Qin Pingping laughed in a low and sharp voice. What you could not do was done by the crown prince. How could you not be angry? How could they not die? The crown prince is dead, the eldest princess is dead, the empress is dead, the empress dowager is dead, and the second prince is also dead. Qin Pingping stared at the emperor with a sharp gaze. All of the family by your side died at your hands. You are the most selfish and vicious ruler in the world. I will have your family die because of your selfishness. The emperor's fingers holding the teacup trembled slightly. Gently hitting the teacup made a crisp sound. Qin Pingping's voice was crisper, colder, and more piercing. I don't have any trump cards. I just came back to the palace to tell you. Back then, you coldly let her die alone, so I can let you also smell that kind of loneliness and then die in this kind of torture. Perhaps I can't kill you, but isn't letting you live like this the most beautiful and complicated method? I still have a few good sons, the emperor slowly said. You even want to kill the third prince, that brat. I can't help but sigh at the coldness and hatred in your heart. Qin Pingping coldly said, as long as it is someone with the surname Li in the palace, they all deserve to die. What about Enji? The emperor's fingers tapping on the porcelain teacup suddenly stopped. He furrowed his brows and said with slight mockery, he is my and Qingmei's son. You are so loyal to her, so how could you repeatedly want to kill him? I'm afraid that even today, and Ji still thinks that you are the elder who loves him the most. He has no idea that the attack in the valley, the aftermath of the Hanging Temple incident, and the fact that he almost died to a dagger, were all single-handedly arranged by you. Qin Pingping was silent for a moment. He then said in a low and ruthless voice, Fan Xian is only a bastard. What right do you have to be the father of her son? For her, Fan Xian's existence is a brand of humiliation. Just looking at him hurts my eyes. The emperor laughed. His laughter was full of resentment. Very good. You are indeed a perverted eunuch. If I just kill you like this, wouldn't that be too much to your liking? How I die has never been a problem. Qin Pingping looked mockingly at the emperor. I only know that my revenge has been successful. That is enough. The emperor's hand holding the teacup hovered in midair. A moment later, he faintly said, I still have 3 sons. But, since I have returned to the capital, I'm afraid none of your 3 sons will be your sons again. Qin Pingping's pupils gradually constricted. With a glimmer of icy pleasure, he laughed sharply and said, If I die to your majesty's hands, how will Fan Xian think of you? How will the eldest son think of you? How will you explain it to Fan Xian? Will he say that I was avenging his mother? Then, how will you explain what happened back then to him? The coldness in Qin Pingping's slightly constricted pupils flared. His face gradually paled, perhaps because of excitement or some other emotion. He stared at the emperor and said word by word, Your Majesty, you will be deserted by everyone. In your loneliness you will look at the land under heaven and have nothing. To look at the land under heaven and have nothing. What kind of vicious curse and hatred was this? The emperor's body shook slightly. His face gradually paled again. He looked at Qin Pingping with a threatening gaze and said in a cold voice, How dare you? When the emperor said these 2 words, it meant that he already knew of Qin Pingping's 20 years of complications. In the end, he had gradually stepped onto an irreversible path of success. Regardless of whether it was Fan Xian or the Great Prince, they were both very close to Qin Pingping. If the Qing Emperor wanted to explain anything to these 2 sons, he would have to touch on the story from many years ago. It was impossible for him to open his mouth. Could it be that the most powerful monarch in the world could only gradually age and die under the furious and hateful gazes of his sons? The Qing Emperor's face was pale. He felt boundless coldness and anger in his heart. He looked at Qin Pingping's similarly pale face and knew that he had already calculated everything that would happen next. He was using his death to launch a final and darkest attack on the royal palace. The royal study sank into a deathly silence. Outside, the autumn rain continued to fall slowly, wetting the originally dry ground in the royal palace and the cracks in the stone slabs. The royal study was filled with glass windows produced by the palace treasury. The carvings on the windows were like human faces looking at the final conversation between the ruler and official of the Qin kingdom. You seek death, but I do not want you to die easily. The emperor's face was pale and his eyes were empty. Like a god forcefully suppressing his anger, he coldly and calmly said, I am going to escort you to the Meridian Gate. I am going to have you stand naked in front of all the people. I am going to let everyone in the world know that you, an old black dog, are a castrated person without a deformed thing that shames your ancestors and ancestors. I am going to have countless people stare between your thighs and see how you, a hateful castrated thief, used the rotten flesh between your legs to weave such an evil plot. The Qing Emperor's words were very light, but they contained boundless hatred, endless humiliation, and endless anger. Coldly he said, I am going to hack you into pieces and die from 1,000 cuts. I am going to have all the people of the Qin kingdom tear off the flesh from your body bite by bite, and then bury your skull by the side of the 3 large workshops. I am going to have you watch with your own eyes how I first kill her, then kill you, and then use what she left behind to slaughter the country, unite the world, and create an everlasting legacy. I am going to have you and all of you know that I can kill you. I am going to have you watch all of this without being able to do anything. I am going to have you cry, struggle, and regret in the underworld. The emperor's face became paler and paler, but his voice became calmer and calmer. His eyes became more and more empty. He was becoming less and less like a living person. Sitting in the black wheelchair, Qin Pingping's face was also very pale. He knew that the genes of a madman ran in the emperor's blood. He also knew what kind of tragic end he would face under the emperor's crazed anger. Ruler and official used each other's words to slice apart each other's hearts. They cut each other until they were both bloody. There was not a place on their bodies that was unharmed. They were like 2 pale ghosts devouring each other's souls. Qin Pingping slowly and with great difficulty bent his body and placed the teacup on the ground. Then he gripped the front of the armrests of the wheelchair with both hands. With his elbows as the axis, his two forearms rested calmly and comfortingly on the black and smooth armrests. He didn't think of anything. He only repeated the habitual action he had repeated countless times over the years. His gaze once again swept past the emperor's pale face and thin and powerful shoulders. He stared straight at the wall behind the royal study. It was as if he could see through the wall and directly into the little building in the rear palace. He saw the painting of the yellow-clothed woman's back incomparably desolate and lonely. She looked at the scene of tens of thousands of people repairing the river at the foot of the mountain. He was speechless for a long time. Qin Pingping was speechless for a long time. He thought to himself that this was good, this was good. Xiao Yezi? A strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. It was as if he could see the image of that little girl floating in the air behind the royal study. That little girl looked at him with distress and asked, "Are you really a eunuch? Then, are we going to call each other sisters or what?" The emperor heard Qin Pingping say these three words. Xiao Yezi. This name had been hidden in his heart for many years. This name was like a curse that he could not free himself from. Although he could not think of it for a long time, once he realized that he had not forgotten, that face and that person would appear out of nowhere and look at him with a glimmer of confusion, sorrow, and disdain. He unconsciously followed Qin Pingping's gaze and turned his head slightly. He then heard a loud sound. There was a loud bang. A wild wind blew in the royal study. Two violent gusts of gunpowder, iron sand, and steel balls blasted violently toward the Qing Emperor's body. The Qing Emperor was a scholar. He would not die so easily. Sister Pingping was a stubborn person. His revenge had actually already accomplished much in the past. He had done his best within the limits of his abilities. Furthermore, the direction of his revenge was correct. As for what he said was only to help Fan Xian in the end, presumably everyone knew. Chapter 697. Without question, Qin Pingping was an ace. More accurately, he had once been an ace. To be more precise, it should be said that Qin Wuchang, one of the eunuchs who guarded the palace back then, although he was not as talented as eunuch Hong Xiang, he was still a person ranked in the ranks. His martial arts cultivation was not to be underestimated. If he had not been an ace, how could he have stood against the powerful Xiao En in the north during the turbulent times? How could he have built the sinister Overwatch Council under the hostile gazes of the entire court? If Qin Pingping had not been an ace, how could he have led the Black Knights to carry out those shocking thousandly surprise attacks on the land like a black storm? However, time and experience were the most effective weapons in the world at torturing people. Too much time had passed. Qin Pingping was already old. It was a pity that during the surprise attack to capture Xiao En and bring him back to the capital, Qin Pingping had been heavily injured. Half his body was paralyzed and he could no longer feel anything below his waist. His cultivation had also been battered away by the wind and rain, leaving nothing behind. This was a history that all the officials and people of the Qing kingdom knew. It was a fact that they either regretted or rejoiced in. When the royal palace sent out the order to capture Qin Pingping and bring him back to the capital, regardless of whether it was Yi Zhong, Gong Dian, Eunuch Yao, or General Shi Fei who was personally in charge of this matter, or He Zongwei who finally knew this secret, none of them turned their wary gazes toward Director Chen's body or the black wheelchair he sat in. They knew that Qin Pingping himself was a cripple. It was impossible for him to have any personal power. Their hearts shivered with fear. It was not because of the power of Qin Pingping's physical body. Rather, it was because of the schemes in this old cripple's head and the powerful Overwatch Council power he could control. An irresistible thought arose in them. Qin Pingping had returned to the capital alone. The Overwatch Council was under close surveillance and the powerful cooperation of a certain important figure within. These important officials by the emperor's side all let out a breath at the same time. As long as Qin Pingping could not use the dark power his withered finger pulled, then the royal palace was safe. Because of this judgment, they were not worried that Qin Pingping would be of any advantage to His Majesty in the imperial study. Even if Qin Pingping was still that powerful warrior on the black warhorse, he would not have any power to fight back in front of His Majesty, the #1 expert in the world. As for the black wheelchair, the old dean had been sitting in this wheelchair for many years. Everyone was used to the wheelchair's existence. They even saw the wheelchair as a part of Qin Pingping. The power of habit is very strong, so strong that people can completely ignore it. Therefore, when Qin Pingping entered the royal study in a black wheelchair, no one, including eunuch Yao, felt any sense of vigilance. These important figures had made a big mistake. Similarly, the emperor had made a mistake the moment his state of mind recovered its indifference and calmness after the long conversation under the dark autumn rain in the morning. When the pale-faced Qin Pingping looked at the snow-white wall of the royal study behind him and quietly called out the woman's name, his state of mind relaxed slightly. Following Qin Pingping's gaze, he looked back and ignored the movement of Qin Pingping's arms on the black armrests of his wheelchair. When everyone was young, perhaps they had played this kind of childish and cute little game. A little friend pretended to see a stern elder or a powerful teacher walking behind him and exclaimed. He was shocked and turned his head to look, only to find that he had been punched. Then the two of them laughed and scolded each other as they chased each other in the yard. Such childish methods were used on the Qing Emperor, the most powerful person in the world. It had to be said that Qin Pingping's thoughts were strange, ingenious, and very effective. Perhaps it was because the emperor's state of mind had been shaken in this instant. Or perhaps it was because the emperor had sunk into a state of absolute confidence after Ku He and Sigujien had died and Yi Luyun had gone out to sea. He did not care about anything. Because he did not care, he turned his head. In the present world, there should not be anyone who could harm this powerful emperor. Even if Fan Xian, Haitang, 13th Wang, Yun Jilan, Lang Qiao, and the Shadow, these 6 upper 9th level aces appeared at the same time in the royal study and delivered a fatal blow to the emperor probably would not be moved in the slightest. When he turned his head back, all he saw was a patch of white and empty air. His pupils constricted slightly. When he turned his head back to look at Qin Pingping in the wheelchair, he saw Qin Pingping's hands that had been on the armrests of the wheelchair the entire time. He gripped the inside of the armrests tightly as his forearm abruptly pulled back. With a crisp click, the 2 sleek and black armrests of the wheelchair suddenly spread to the sides and made a beautiful series of metal springs. Following 2 loud sounds that rang out at almost the same time, 2 powerful currents of air suddenly shot out from the 2 holes that had suddenly appeared at the front of the armrests. Bang! Crisp and efficient, without the slightest hesitation. Cold and callous, Qin Pingping gripped the armrest of the wheelchair, the 2 armrests he had touched for countless years, and pulled the trigger. Countless metal shavings and steel balls, supported by the powerful spray of gunpowder, crashed toward the Qing Emperor's body with incomparable power. The black wheelchair emitted 2 dazzling, soul-stealing sparks. There was no one in this world who could harm the emperor, but that did not mean there was nothing that could harm him. At least, the emperor and Qin Pingping both knew that the mysterious black chest could certainly pose a threat to the emperor. Now, the wheelchair Qin Pingping had sat in for decades seemed to have a similar effect. This black wheelchair was a wheelchair the Palace Treasury and Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council had meticulously built decades ago. The pair of firearms that contained the fury of countless years were personally made for Qin Pingping by the woman who had died a long time ago. At that time, Qin Pingping had been crippled. She had been worried about his safety, so she had mobilized all of her abilities and secretly arranged such a life-saving treasure for him. During these years, the black wheelchair seat rims and backrest had been changed countless times, but the armrest had never been changed. Many people knew that Qin Pingping had a habitual action. He liked to gently stroke the pair of smooth armrests. People close to him like Fan Xian knew that whenever he was alone and quiet, the director liked to use his knuckles to gently tap the armrests. Each time the armrest would make a buzzing sound like hollow bamboo. Bamboo had joints, strength, and bones. Qin Pingping also had them. 2 sparks exploded in front of the wheelchair's armrests. After 2 loud muffled bangs rang out at almost the same time, the sound of countless steel balls, iron scraps, and gunpowder hitting the body of the supreme being of the 9-5 rang out. It was like rain hitting the beach, like hail falling onto the ground, and thousands of holes were formed and countless banana leaves were broken. Smoke filled the royal study but quickly dispersed. Gradually, it revealed the figure of the emperor sitting on the soft couch. The Qing emperor was a great grandmaster. In the end, a great grandmaster was not a god. Their corporeal bodies were still mortal bodies. Their thoughts were incomparably powerful, but they could not make godlike reactions. When Qin Pingping pulled the trigger on the wheelchair, he was very close to the Qing emperor. The bullets that shot out from the front of the armrests covered half the space with unusual power. Even though the Qing emperor had swept aside in an instant like an immortal, he could not escape the killing range of these soul-devouring weapons that shot out quickly. Thus the Qing emperor did not dodge. He continued to sit on the soft couch. The walls around him had been beaten into a rotten ulcer. Gray stone and broken bricks rustled down. A few broken pieces of wall skin hung in midair. Half of the low couch beneath him had been shattered. The table in front of him had been smashed into splinters of wood. Many holes appeared on the dragon robe on the emperor's body. They were tiny, torn, and of different shapes and trajectories. The openings of the holes gave off a slightly charred feeling. A pair of hands covered his face. The index finger of his left hand was slightly bent, and the thumb was slightly raised. The bright green porcelain teacup was in the mouth of his thumb and index finger, not moving at all. Even the teacup had not shattered, so the emperor's appearance was unharmed. In reality, all of this happened in a very short instant. The power around the emperor's body was almost tangible, howling like the wind. The celadone teacup between his fingers flew through the air with a whoosh. 2 gunshots rang out. The black wheelchair was sent flying by a powerful force and slid backward at an astonishing speed. The wheelchair squeaked as it rubbed against the ground of the royal study like it was about to create sparks. In the end, it crashed ruthlessly into the wall of the royal study with a muffled thud. Chen Pingping's expression was indifferent. His pupils constricted slightly. Before he could do anything, he saw a smear of jade green reflected in his eyes. With a crisp crack, the teacup that had flown in from beyond the sky nailed ruthlessly into Chen Pingping's thin and weak chest. Who knew how many of his ribs were broken? Countless powder-like porcelain shards pierced into Chen Pingping's body like countless needles. The pain and itch were not something a normal person could endure. A mouthful of black blood sprayed out from Chen Pingping's lips and wet the front of his shirt. Immediately after, an invisible and boundless true energy surged out from the air, instantly controlling the remaining 3 meridians and 6 meridians in his body, controlling the movement of every muscle in his body, causing him to be unable to speak, unable to move, and unable to understand his own life. What was even more terrifying was that the royal Wei genuine qi actually penetrated through the air and clothes, quickly seeping into his body, following his meridians to travel in all directions, and in the blink of an eye, it slowly forced out the poison that the old dean had already consumed. It was like there was a giant invisible hand in the air tightly gripping Chen Pingping's withered body. It lifted him up from the black wheelchair and suspended him in the air. This scene appeared particularly strange. Chen Pingping's grizzled hair had long been messed up. It scattered messily across his forehead and gently covered the deep wrinkles on his face. His clothes were covered in tears. In an instant, his entire aura of life was suppressed to the edge of death. However, this old man's eyes were cold and callous. There was not a trace of fear. There was only a glimmer of regret and disdain. Gradually, even these emotions disappeared from his eyes. There was only calmness. The sound of heavy footsteps rang out in the royal study. The emperor slowly and heavily stepped on the rubble on the ground and walked toward him. The emperor's right hand opened slightly. A number of powerful zhenqi broke through the air and held Chen Pingping's small body firmly in midair. Other than the coldness in the emperor's eyes, there was a glimmer of a furious blood-red color. The emperor's hands trembled slightly. They were covered in fresh blood and terrifying wounds. The small holes in the emperor's dragon robe began to bleed out and seep endlessly out of his body. It washed away the metal shards and burnt remnants of the gunpowder on the wounds. The dragon robe had already been smoked into a black paste. The emperor was heavily injured. The steel balls that could pierce through stone should still be in his body. In the end, he did not die. The shards of the porcelain cup were in Chen Pingping's body. He also began to bleed. Perhaps there was not much blood in his body to begin with, so the speed at which it flowed was not fast. In an instant, it soaked his tattered black Overwatch Council official robes. The emperor walked to Chen Pingping's side. His chest rose and fell slightly. Ruler and officials' bodies were both covered in small wounds that went deep into their flesh. The pain was at its deepest. Blood flowed endlessly. They looked very similar. He lowered his head and glanced at the ghastly wound on his chest. The corners of his brows trembled slightly. It was as if he had not thought that there would still be someone in this world who could bring him so close to death. An uncontrollable resentment and anger began to ferment and rise within the monarch's body. The emperor's hand gripped Chen Pingping's throat. He stared into his eyes. A bone-chilling hatred flashed through his eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "If I don't let you die, you cannot die." A number of gray shadows flashed past outside the glass window of the royal study. A few people abruptly smashed open the wooden door and charged in. At the gate of the garden, Yi Zhong, Eunuch Yao, and a few other important figures stayed far away from the imperial study, but they heard the 2 loud bangs clearly. They knew that something was wrong and rushed over to protect the emperor as fast as they could, but they were still too late. Yi Zhong arrived the fastest, followed by Eunuch Yao. However, when they entered the royal study and saw the bloody scene in front of them, they remained silent at the same time. This was because the scene was too painful for their eyes to bear. They saw the blood-covered emperor choking the blood-covered director Qin. Their hearts were shocked and they didn't know what to say. The emperor let go and allowed Qin Pingping's body to fall from his hands. It landed on the floor with a muffled thud. He used a strange gaze to look at his old comrade, old companion, and old servant at his feet. In a cold and resentful voice he said, "Escort him to the Overwatch Council's prison. Tomorrow execute this traitor by 1,000 cuts. If this old dog dies before 36,000 cuts, you and the useless Imperial Academy of Medicine will accompany him in death." Yi Zhong and eunuch Yao felt as if they had fallen into an icehouse. He Zhongwei, who had just run out of the royal study with a face full of panic, heard these words and trembled in fear. It was not only because of the shocking scene in front of him, Qin Pingping's crime, or the emperor's bone-chilling and bone-deep angry edict. In the 30 years of the court, there had never been a high-ranking official who had been executed by 1,000 cuts. This was the most humiliating and cruel way to die. Furthermore, this edict was directed at Qin Pingping. The three of them did not dare to say anything. They only immediately knelt down at the emperor's feet and did not dare to remonstrate. The emperor glanced one last time at Qin Pingping, who was looking at him with a mocking gaze. He suddenly felt a burning pain in his chest. "How many years has it been since I've been injured?" the emperor thought to himself. Then his body swayed. "The emperor has been assassinated. Summon the imperial doctors." Grand Scholar He's panicked and anxious voice rang out in the royal study. Yi Chong was currently supporting the emperor's slumping body in fear. He subconsciously tilted his head slightly and glanced at the vicious Grand Scholar from the corner of his eye. The royal palace was in a state of panic. The imperial doctors filed in and out of the palace. Occasionally, pale-faced palace maids and eunuchs carried golden basins in and out. The water in the basins had already been dyed red with blood. Eunuch Yao was attending to the injured emperor inside the hall. Gong Dian led the imperial army and internal court aces to surround the entire royal palace. Yi Zhong, after sending out a few orders to the Bureau of Military Affairs, stood guard outside the hall. The head doctor of the Imperial Academy of Medicine walked out of the hall, sweating profusely. Yi Zhong looked at him coldly and asked, "How is the emperor?" The doctor of the Imperial Academy of Medicine saw him and replied in a trembling voice, "Teacher Yi, although the emperor is injured, his pulse is strong. He should be fine, but..." Yi Zhong furrowed his brows and shouted in a stern voice, "But what?" "But, the metal shards stuck in the emperor's skin and flesh have been removed, but looking at the wounds on the emperor's body, there should still be sharp objects left in the emperor's body and injured his internal organs. If these sharp objects are not taken out, I'm afraid." "Afraid of what? Will the emperor be in danger?" "The emperor's good fortune fills the heavens. He has never been a mortal." The doctor of the Imperial Academy of Medicine spoke in a trembling voice. He changed his method of describing the emperor's great-grandmaster realm and said, "Presumably there won't be any major problems, but no one knows if there will be any effects in the future. Then think of a way to take them out." Yi Zhong's body was short and stout. He had always given people a gentle feeling. At this moment, the murderous aura on his face was incomparably terrifying. "I really don't have such a good method." The doctor saw Yi Zhong's expression grow uglier and uglier. He quickly swallowed and said, "However, Sir Fan Jr. once presided over a similar medical case in the palace. Please quickly summon Sir Fan Jr. back to the capital. With him presiding over this matter, presumably, there won't be any hidden dangers." The Duke of Dambois? After Yi Zhong heard this name, his heart skipped a beat. His heart chilled. From morning until now, inside and outside Jingdo, in the royal study in the royal palace, too many things had happened. He had not completely digested it all. Only now, hearing Fan Xian's name, did he think of the great impact Qin Pingping's attempt to assassinate the emperor could have on the Qin kingdom. Yi Zhong's lips were a bit dry. A moment later he slowly said, "Sir Fan Jr. won't be back for a while. Is there any other way?" The young lady of the Fan family is currently practicing medicine in the Dambois medical shop. Her teacher is Qin Shan, and Sir Fan Jr. has personally... A cold light flashed through Yi Zhong's eyes. He straightforwardly said, "Quickly summon her into the palace." After the doctor led the guards away, Yi Zhong suddenly felt that his back was covered in cold sweat. A large patch had become damp. Only now did he have time to analyze the situation at hand. The doctor had mentioned Fan Xian's name. He couldn't help but think that, not long after, this young powerful official would use the credit of swallowing Dongyi to return to the capital. At that time, if Fan Xian discovered that Qin Pingping had already been executed by the emperor, what kind of reaction would he make? Yi Zhong felt a chill envelop his body. The emperor was heavily injured, and Director Chen's life was hanging by a thread. Another group of imperial doctors were treating him. He would then be sent to the Overwatch Council's prison overnight. He knew why the emperor had ordered Qin Pingping to be sent to the Overwatch Council in the end. The mind of an emperor still did not forget to display its coldness at such a time. Presently, all of Jingdo's defenses were in Yi Zhong's hands. He had no intention of rebelling against the emperor's edict. However, he felt a weight that was difficult to bear. If the Overwatch Council truly rebelled, what should he do? Fortunately, the emperor was only injured and not truly unconscious. There was no need to worry about what had happened between the emperor and Director Chen. In the royal study, everyone had seen Director Chen assassinate the emperor. No one could and no one dared to intercede on his behalf. Assassinating His Majesty was a crime punishable by death by 1,000 cuts. A chill rose in Yi Zhong's heart. He understood the relationship and friendship the emperor and Qin Pingping once had. The emperor was probably angry and disappointed to give Director Chen such a wretched end. Ever since the founding of the Qin kingdom, the imperial power had been as difficult to shake as it had been in the thousands of years of history on this land. The successive emperors of the Qin kingdom had always maintained a warm attitude toward their officials. Particularly during these decades, the Qin laws had been revised a few times and had abolished countless cruel punishments. Even for those who rebelled, it was often beheading and exterminating their families. The emperor had always been gentle toward scholars and officials in court. Even during the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, he had only executed the commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Diqing. Compared to Director Chen of the Overwatch Council, what was Zhang Diqing? Yi Zhong slowly closed his eyes and couldn't help but think of the word scholar he had cried out in a shrill voice when the emperor had fallen into his arms earlier. Involuntarily, a chill flashed across the corners of his lips. The news of Qin Pingping assassinating the emperor immediately spread through the entire royal palace through He Zongwei's cry and startled everyone in the palace. Then it became news that everyone in Jingdo knew. The emperor might have thought about the stability of the Qin court, the attitude of Fan Xian and all of the Overwatch Council officials, or perhaps, all of the contributions Director Chen had made to the Qin kingdom these years. No, Yi Zhong understood the emperor's personality. Even if he wanted to bestow Director Chen a glorious death, it would not be because of the friendship between the emperor and this old director. After the strange sound of the weapon in the royal study, the emperor only felt anger and hatred toward Qin Pingping. There was nothing else. The only thing that could make the emperor retract the death by 1,000 cuts was for the future of the Qin kingdom, for the moods of Fan Xian, the great prince who was currently stationed in Dongyi, and for the sake of the kingdom. There were many ways to die. Comparing the incomparably humiliating and cruel death by 1,000 cuts to a piece of white silk and a cup of poisoned wine, the former would certainly make the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, and the great prince feel more resentment. Yet all of this, because of Scholar He's perfectly timed cry of surprise, became something impossible because the Son of Heaven had his dignity and anger. Yi Zhong sighed and looked in a daze at the royal palace under the autumn rain. All sorts of emotions filled his heart. He didn't know how much would happen in the Overwatch Council square building tonight. Would the tens of thousands of elite soldiers he and Shifei had been ordered to guard outside the Overwatch Council really need to fight? The autumn rain slowly fell. He gently coughed a few times. He knew that the Emperor's angry order could not be changed. He could only hope that when Fan Xian returned, the matter would be settled. Otherwise, no one knew how chaotic the Qin kingdom would become. The autumn rain was also falling outside the Overwatch Council square building. It grew colder and colder. Yan Bingyun stood coldly by the window. The black cloth that had been covering the window the entire time had been torn off by him and thrown to the ground. He looked calmly in the direction of the royal palace and calmly and forcefully gave out a series of orders. Relying on Qin Pingping and Fan Xian's trust, he had already grasped a great deal of power in the Overwatch Council. However, with just this power, he was still unable to suppress the ghostly fire burning faintly inside the Overwatch Council. The black ghostly fire that grew from the hearts of these black-robed officials was a good thing. Fortunately, Yan Bingyun had made sufficient preparations beforehand. The senior officials who were incomparably loyal to old Director Chen had already been sent to Shiliang, Jiangnan, and Dongyi by him. They had already left Jingdo. Otherwise, the situation would be even more difficult to control. The news from the palace had already reached the council. The news of old Director Chen assassinating the emperor had already become reality. The emperor was heavily injured? Yan Bingyun didn't know if this was the emperor's excuse or if Director Chen, whom he had always admired, had truly done what many people could not. However, none of this was important. He coldly turned his gaze and looked at the streets and alleys outside the Overwatch Council and the Qin Kingdom's elite soldiers who were not hiding their tracks. He shook his head. He had to protect this council, particularly when Qin Pingping was certain to die and Fan Xian had yet to return. No one could oppose the emperor and the powerful state apparatus of the Qin Kingdom, even if the Overwatch Council was the most powerful part of this apparatus. Yan Bingyun turned his head and looked at the 7 leaders in the room. Faintly he said, "Prepare to take over." He furrowed his brows. After a slight pause, he finished this sentence with great difficulty. Imperial Criminal Qin Pingping. Chapter 698. I really couldn't say anything about soliciting votes. However, I had said at the beginning of the month that these were the last few dozen chapters of the year of Qinyu. I would use my utmost seriousness to write them, and I would also use my utmost seriousness to solicit votes. I would not leave behind any regrets. Chapter 699. As the words, Imperial Criminal Chen Pingping, came out of Yan Bingyun's thin lips, everyone in the secret room of the Overwatch Council went crazy. Their faces remained calm, but a glimmer of ruthlessness flashed through their eyes. They stared viciously at Yan Bingyun's face as if they wanted to use their gazes to tear Yan Bingyun into pieces. Of the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council, other than the head of the 6th bureau who was temporarily in charge and Jinggu of the 5th bureau, who was slowly moving toward the east of the Qin Kingdom, all of the high-ranking officials were gathered there. They were the true power figures of the Overwatch Council. The head of the 1st bureau was Mu Tai, the head of the 2nd bureau was that old man, the head of the 3rd bureau was Fan Xian's senior disciple, and the heads of the 7th and 8th bureaus were all members of the Qinian unit. Including Yan Bingyun, who was also the head of the 4th bureau, everyone in the secret room was actually Fan Xian's direct line of descent. Fan Xian's direct subordinates were also Qin Pingping's direct subordinates. Although they did not have much interaction with Director Qin, just like every official and secret agent in the Overwatch Council, the old director was their ancestor. In their hearts, he held an incomparably lofty position. Other than Yan Bingyun, the other 6 people all abruptly stood up and stared at Yan Bingyun's face. The head of the 1st bureau, Mu Tai's iron-like face was incomparably angry. In a raspy voice he roared, "Sir Yan, what do you want to do?" Yan Bingyun returned the gaze of these 6 people without shrinking back. Ever since they had returned from fighting in northern Qi, Qin Pingping and Fan Xian had been too lazy to deal with the complicated council affairs. In reality, during these years, all the matters of the Overwatch Council, big or small, had been handled by this icy young master. He was the young master of Yan Ruohai's manor. He was very experienced in the council. Back then, when he was only a youth, he had been sent to the unusually dangerous northern Qi to carry out spy operations. Afterward, he had been sold out by the eldest princess. No one knew what kind of cruel torture he had endured, so his reputation in the council was very high. Particularly after Fan Xian gradually took over the power of the Overwatch Council, as Fan Xian's partner and closest subordinate, regardless of whether it was dealing with the Ming family matter in Jiangnan, the battle with the eldest princess, the royal palace, or the rebellion in Jingdo, he had demonstrated a valiant ability to organize, analyze intelligence and make decisions. With seniority, experience, effort, sacrifice and background, Sir Yan Jr. successfully obtained a position in the Overwatch Council below 2 people and above tens of thousands. Thus, all the officials, even the heads of the various bureaus who were of the same rank in name, tacitly approved of his assignments. They admired Sir Yan Jr. from the bottom of their hearts. The corners of Yan Bingyun's eyes twitched slightly. Looking at the 6 people in front of him, he did not back down at all. Word by word he said, "Qin Pingping attempted to assassinate the emperor. Tomorrow he will be executed by 1,000 cuts. I will accept this criminal. Do you want a rebel?" News of the assassination attempt on the emperor had long spread from the palace. The high-ranking officials of the Overwatch Council had gotten hold of this information at the first moment. Amidst their shock, They learned that the old director had not followed the 30 black carriages back to his hometown to retire. Instead, he had unexpectedly reappeared in the royal palace. Furthermore, he had attempted to assassinate the emperor. None of the Overwatch Council officials believed this was the truth, much less the 6 heads of the various bureaus. They looked coldly at Yan Bingyun. In the end, it was Mu Tai who opened his mouth and said angrily, "The director has returned to his hometown to retire. How could he appear in the royal palace again? Assassinate the emperor? Who made up this rumor? What exactly happened in the palace?" The head of the 3rd Bureau, who had been silent the entire time, lowered his head and slowly said, "I thought the most important thing right now was to investigate clearly." Yan Bingyun was furious. He slammed his palm down on the long table, making a buzzing sound. In a stern voice he said, "The emperor personally issued an edict. Commander Yi, Eunuch Yao, Scholar He, and everyone saw it with their own eyes. Investigate? Investigate what?" The most experienced and highest-ranking head of the 2nd Bureau suddenly lowered his eyelids and said in a deep and raspy voice, "So what if we saw it with our own eyes? I think the emperor just wants to take action against our stupid council." This old man raised his face coldly and said, "If you want to pin a crime on someone, you can always find a pretext. If the emperor wants to kill someone, what reason can't he find? However, this matter involves the old director. Other than the crime of plotting to assassinate the emperor, what other crime can be used against him?" It was completely silent in the secret room. The glass window, which was originally covered by a black cloth, was particularly transparent. Everyone felt a glimmer of unfamiliarity. Outside, the sun was gradually sinking in the west. It shone its light onto the red palace walls of the royal palace and into the secret room of the Overwatch Council, enveloping the entire room in a blood-red light. The head of the 2nd Bureau narrowed his eyes and looked at Yan Bingyun. Slowly he said, "Sir Yan, the final appointment of the commissioner has not been made. You have no right to order us to do anything. You have even less right to pull down this black cloth." The silence in the secret room made one's heart beat faster. All of the high-ranking officials of the Overwatch Council looked at Yan Bingyun, wanting to see how he was going to deal with this shocking matter. Mu Tai and the others listened to the words of this senior from the 2nd Bureau. The confusion in their eyes gradually grew. Their gazes as they looked at Yan Bingyun began to grow cold. "All of the intelligence reports in the council have to go through me. A few days ago, the Jingdo garrison mysteriously disappeared, the Imperial Army and palace defenses suddenly tightened, and the Bureau of Military Affairs secretly moved troops. I have sent all of this information to your desk." The head of the 2nd Bureau looked at Yan Bingyun coldly and said, "Looking at it now, this is the emperor's way of dealing with the old director, but you, why don't you have any reaction at all?" Yan Bingyun's earlier anger disappeared in the blink of an eye. His face was cold and a chill emanated from all over his body. It was as if his entire person was a block of ice. "During this half-month, you moved most of the people in my bureau to Shiliang and Dongyi. Most of them are probably still on their way." The head of the 2nd Bureau looked at him coldly and said, "Presently, the strength of the council is not even a third of what it was in the past. What exactly do you want to do? Did you know about today's events long ago, so you were making preparations for the palace ahead of time? Most of the swordsmen and assassins of the 6th Bureau have also been moved out of Jingdo a few days ago." The temporary head of the 6th Bureau looked coldly at Yan Bingyun. He was the most powerful assassin in the Overwatch Council after the Shadow. His gaze was like a sword nailing Yan Bingyun. It was as if he wanted to nail this piece of ice into the twilight and allow him to gradually melt. "You must give us an explanation." The 3 most powerful bureaus in the Overwatch Council were the 4th, 6th, and 6th Bureaus. The Black Knights of the 5th Bureau could never stay near Jingdo. Furthermore, a portion of the Black Knights had left with the black carriages. A portion was near Yanjing to receive Fan Xian's return. The 4th Bureau was under Yan Bingyun's control. Furthermore, they were scattered among various provinces and foreign countries. It was impossible for them to gather in Jingdo. When Yan Bingyun ordered the 6th Bureau's swordsmen and assassins to be moved, the Overwatch Council's most powerful martial force had been weakened to its limit. Mu Tai's heart trembled. He managed the 1st Bureau in Jingdo, so the Overwatch Council's orders and movements did not affect him. It was not until now that he realized Yan Bingyun had already secretly moved so much of the council's strength. Thinking of the shocking change in the royal palace and old Director Qin, his heart chilled. "I am an official of the Qin Kingdom, an official of the Emperor, and an official of the Overwatch Council. Yan Bingyun's preparations from a few days ago had been directly exposed by these officials, but there was not a trace of guilt on his face. He looked coldly at the people standing on both sides of the long table and said each word clearly, "Don't forget the first words you learned when you first entered the council. Everything is for the Qing kingdom." Yan Bingyun waved his hand coldly. "Loyalty to the emperor is the only thing we need to consider. Your words earlier were already somewhat treasonous. I don't want to hear them a second time." Earlier, the high-ranking officials of the Overwatch Council had displayed their resentment toward the royal palace very well. If people outside the council knew of this, it would be no different from the crime of deceiving the ruler. Yan Bingyun slowly walked to the window and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the blood-red dusk reflected in from outside. His cold voice seeped out from between his teeth. "Qin Pingping assassinated the emperor and is a clear act of rebellion. If you insist on acting your own way and collude with this traitor to do something, don't blame me for being merciless." The secret room once again fell silent. The temporary head of the 6th Bureau slowly gripped the handle of the metal drill at his waist. He looked coldly at Yan Bingyun by the window and said, "Although you transferred away most of the people under me, I think that if the 6th Bureau wanted to kill you, it would not be a difficult matter. So what if you kill me?" Yan Bingyun's tone carried cold disdain. "You want to rebel? Where can your family and the families of the swordsmen under your command escape to? There are 10,000 soldiers outside. Even if you save the old director, can you kill your way out?" The dusk fell on Yan Bingyun's frosty face and presented a complicated color. He slowly turned his head and looked at the head of the 6th Bureau. Coldly he said, "The Emperor's edict arrived this morning. I have the director's order in my hand. From now on I am the 3rd Commissioner of the Overwatch Council. You must abide by my orders. Otherwise you will be dealt with according to council regulations." "Sir Yan, I don't know what you are thinking in your heart." Mu Tai, who had appeared somewhat dull and muddle-headed these past few years, suddenly opened his mouth and sincerely said, "Yes, with just those swordsmen and assassins, the most they can do is save the old director in the council. They cannot send the old director out of Jingdo." "But..." Mu Tai's eyes lit up. They were particularly bright on his dark face. "My 1st Bureau is still here. If the 8 bureaus work together, no matter who they want to save in the capital, it's not impossible. The 1st Bureau has people hidden in each of the important yamens. The 4th Bureau must also have backup. If you can't do it, Sir Yin will certainly have a way," the head of the 2nd Bureau said coldly. "The 8th Bureau will immediately incite the Imperial College to cause trouble. No matter what reason, as long as Jingdo falls into chaos, the 3rd Bureau will immediately act. They will poison the water in Jingdo and force Jingdo to open its doors tomorrow. Fire will burn everywhere. Once they act, it will be easy to save the old director alone." No wonder he was one of the oldest people in the Overwatch Council. With just a few casual words, he had clearly organized the actions needed to save Qin Pingping and easily spoke of such a sinister and ruthless plan. Poison the water in Jingdo? Yan Bingyun's pupils constricted. "You want the families of all the officials of the Overwatch Council and the people of Jingdo to die with him? The Overwatch Council has the power to turn Jingdo into a wasteland if we are truly determined to do so." The head of the 2nd Bureau's face was cold as if he was talking about a normal matter. As long as the old director can live, what does the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people matter? Yan Bingyun's heart trembled slightly. It was not until now that he realized that the Overwatch Council he had given his entire life to had long forgotten the existence of the Emperor. All of the officials were crazy. For Qin Pingping, they would truly disregard any price and do countless crazy things. "I won't give you this opportunity." Yan Bingyun's eyes narrowed. He gently knocked on the little bell on the long table. A wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the secret room. The expressions of the heads of the 8 bureaus suddenly changed. They knew something was wrong. Mu Tai's finger trembled slightly. Looking at Yan Bingyun's face, he became more and more agitated. In a loud voice, he said, "Do you want to watch as the old director dies in humiliation tomorrow?" Yan Bingyun's face was cold and he didn't say anything. The door to the secret room was pushed open. His trusted officials filed in. In a short amount of time they controlled every corner of the room. The temporary head of the 6th Bureau continued to hold the metal rod tightly in his hand. He paid no attention to the people walking in behind him. He only looked coldly at Yan Bingyun. The Jingdo Overwatch Council was powerful, but this square and sinister building was only a brain. Their true power was hidden in each of the different yamens and dark places. The heads in this secret room were like the brains of the Overwatch Council. As long as this brain was destroyed, the Overwatch Council officials would be like a group of dragons without a head. No matter how angry they were because of the Qin Pingping matter, it would be difficult for them to coalesce into a powerful force. It was clear that Yan Bingyun had prepared for this change for a long time. After the situation in the secret room was initially controlled, the Qing elite troops that had been guarding the outside split off a column of 1,000 people and moved closer to the Overwatch Council. A series of concentrated footsteps and the metallic clang of light armor rang out around the square and sinister building, made one feel oppressed and moved. A few faint shouts came from the great hall of the Overwatch Council downstairs. Then it seemed that someone was reading an edict. No one in the secret room paid attention to these sounds. The six heads only stared angrily and hatefully at Yan Bingyun's face. Yan Bingyun looked at Mu Tai, who had a face full of disbelief, and calmly said, "In Jingdo, the first bureau has the most people in control, so I cannot let you out. You can be wronged in prison for a while." Mu Tai's eyes seemed to be spitting fire. He and Yan Bingyun were both Fan Xian's trusted aides. The two of them had a good relationship. Based on his usual understanding, he could not believe that Yan Bingyun would choose to viciously stab Director Qin in the back for the sake of glory and wealth. The head of the second bureau closed his eyes and listened carefully to the sounds around him. His brain spun quickly as he analyzed the difference in strength between the two sides. After a long time, he opened his eyes and sighed sorrowfully. He knew that with the help of the court's powerful military power, Yan Bingyun had successfully separated the Overwatch Council's head from its limbs. More accurately, as long as Yan Bingyun controlled this square and sinister building, the Overwatch Council would become half useless. "Don't attack." He gently patted the shoulder of the temporary head of the Sixth Bureau and had him loosen his grip on the metal rod. The head of the Second Bureau had the highest seniority in this secret room. The head of the Sixth Bureau had a ruthless expression, but he knew that the situation was set. He couldn't help but raise his head to the sky with a muffled grunt and loosen his hand. The head of the Second Bureau looked coldly at Yan Bingyun and said, "We are probably all going to die." Yan Bingyun lowered his eyelids slightly and slowly said, "You don't know that Qin Pingping tried to assassinate the emperor. As long as you don't make any mistakes, I will protect your lives." The head of the Second Bureau sighed and touched his already white hair. Thinking of something, he smiled self-mockingly and suddenly said, "I wonder what Brother Ruahai will think after he learns of today's events? However, Sir Yin, I urge you to kill all of us old men. Otherwise, if we live another day, you won't be able to sleep peacefully." This was not a threat. It was a sincere and naked declaration. The details of what happened in the Overwatch Council would one day be leaked. If the heads of the 8 bureaus were not silenced, Yan Bingyun would certainly face the anger of the Overwatch Council officials who were loyal to Qin Pingping and angry because of Qin Pingping's death. How many of those officials were there? No one knew how many times Yan Bingyun had to die for their anger. No one knew either. After the head of the Second Bureau finished speaking, he was escorted out the door by a few officials. His back appeared slightly hunched and dim. This was not because he was about to go to prison. Rather, it was because he was thinking of Director Qin, who was going to die tomorrow. The temporary head of the 6 bureau's metal drills, crossbow bolts, daggers, inner armor, poison powder, and all the weapons that could be used to kill were all found. The head's face was cold and he did not resist at all. As he was escorted past Yan Bingyun, he spat on his face. Yan Bingyun used his snow-white sleeve to gently wipe the spit off his face. Looking at him, he said, "Since you want to provoke me into killing you, why didn't you resist earlier?" "I don't want to die yet." The temporary head of the 6th Bureau looked at him and said in a strange laugh, "Because I want to see how you, a traitor, die in the end." Mu Tai was also escorted out. He turned his head to glance at Yan Bingyun and helped the temporary head of the 6th Bureau explain, "We very much want to know how badly you will die when Sir Fan Jr. returns." Yan Bingyun's expression changed, but he still maintained his silence. A vanguard of 1,000 Dingzhou soldiers, Imperial Army and garrison troops had already been stationed in the square building of the Overwatch Council under the leadership of a few eunuchs and important figures in court. All of the Overwatch Council officials were gathered on the flat ground behind the building. It was not that no one wanted to resist. Many people did not know what was happening. In front of the Emperor's edict and without orders from the higher-ups, these loyal Overwatch Council officials would not blindly retaliate. This was the first time since the Overwatch Council was founded that it had been occupied and humiliatingly occupied. Before today, regardless of whether it was the Bureau of Military Affairs or the officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, none of them had any influence over this council. No army could enter here. As long as this council had the old cripple in the black wheelchair, as long as he was alive, no one dared to enter without fear. Dense footsteps rang out on the stairs. A group of people came down and walked out of the door to the large and calm courtyard behind the Overwatch Council. All of the Overwatch Council officials found that the leaders of the 8 bureaus had become prisoners. No matter how determined they were, they couldn't help but be shaken. Unconsciously they surged forward. Just as was said earlier, the 5th bureau was not in the capital. The 6th bureau had been moved too much by Yen Bingyun. The Overwatch Council's martial power had been emptied. Most of the people in the square building were civil officials. For example, the officials of the 2nd bureau who hunched over their desks and did intelligence work all had problems with their backs. For example, the skilled craftsmen of the 3rd bureau who were skilled in making drugs had not seen the sun for a long time. Being shown by the setting sun, they all felt dazed. The officials of the 7th and 8th bureaus were not known for their martial power. Yen Bingyun walked at the back. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the movements around him. Standing in front of his trusted officials, he walked toward the eunuchs and officials in front of the imperial soldiers. The one leading the army into the Overwatch Council was He Zhongwei. He looked at the frosty Yen Bingyun and nodded his head slightly in greeting. An old eunuch at his side bent his body and said to Yen Bingyun, "Can you announce the edict?" Yen Bingyun furrowed his brows and said, "Have these soldiers put down the knives and spears in their hands. Otherwise I can't guarantee that they won't all be poisoned to death in a moment." The old eunuch paused slightly. After using his gaze to ask for He Zhongwei's meaning, he signaled to the commander of the 1,000-man group. The commander's heart chilled slightly, but he obeyed and ordered the mixed troops to put down the knives and spears in their hands. The atmosphere immediately relaxed a little. Yen Bingyun did not give the Overwatch Council subordinates any chance to react. The group escorting the heads of the 8 bureaus had already left the council and headed toward the prison. A clamor immediately broke out. Yen Bingyun nodded his head in greeting to the bent old eunuch. The old eunuch's body trembled as he walked in front of the 200 or so Overwatch Council officials. Clearing his throat, he began to slowly read out the crimes of the previous director of the Overwatch Council, Qin Pingping, for plotting rebellion and attempting to assassinate the emperor. The atmosphere became more and more oppressive. All of the Overwatch Council officials' faces became more and more shocked. The emotions in their eyes became more and more complicated. The suspicion and anger that came from the bottom of their hearts grew stronger and stronger. The old eunuch's voice became lower and lower and more panicked. It was as if he could not go on. The commander of the mixed elite Qing army also became more and more nervous. Although none of the 200 Overwatch Council officials were skilled in martial arts, who knew what kind of powerful figures they were before they became civil servants? Wang Qinian, one of the 2 wings of the Overwatch Council, had once hidden in this building as a scribe for many years. If these people truly rebelled in anger, what kind of ending would there be? Although the 3rd Bureau officials did not carry weapons, who knew how the poison on their bodies would be spread? The atmosphere in the courtyard grew more and more tense. It was as if it could break at any moment. Coincidentally, the old eunuch finished reading the edict. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and cried out in his heart that he had been lucky. Although the Overwatch Council officials showed deep suspicion, shock, and anger in their eyes, not a single one of them moved. This was a true iron army, a group made of iron. As long as their superiors did not give the order, they would continue to wait until they could wait no longer. Countless gazes looked at Yen Bingyun standing at the very front because he was the highest-ranking official in the Overwatch Council. Although there was suspicion in these gazes, they still waited for Yen Bingyun to speak. Yen Bingyun was silent for a moment but did not open his mouth to explain anything to these Overwatch Council officials. Instead, he looked directly toward the tunnel in the courtyard. A few imperial doctors, a few eunuchs, and dozens of internal guards carried a stretcher and walked in from the tunnel. A skinny old man with a head full of messy white hair was on the stretcher. The blood on his body had already stopped. However, he seemed to still be unconscious. The ancestor of the Overwatch Council, the emperor of this patch of darkness, Qin Pingping, once again returned to the Overwatch Council he had single-handedly created. He returned to his favorite courtyard. However, none of this was accompanied by the familiar creaking of the wheelchair. He just lay alone on the stretcher. In the courtyard at the beginning of autumn, the fish in the white sand pond were still swimming. However, Qin Pingping could not open his eyes and glance in that direction. Yen Bingyun stood straight like a javelin. Looking at the approaching stretcher, the hands behind his back trembled slightly. They immediately returned to normal. He knew this was a crucial moment. He knew why the emperor had sent Qin Pingping back to the Overwatch Council to be locked up. It was because he wanted to use the old director who was about to die, to be executed by 1,000 cuts, to stimulate the hearts of everyone in the Overwatch Council. The emperor had to know whether this Overwatch Council was Qin Pingping's or his own. Once he confirmed that the council was no longer his, the cold, emotionless, and powerful emperor would presumably not mind using countless soldiers to charge into this dark courtyard and the countless branches under heaven to thoroughly clean it and not leave any traces in the world. He coldly watched the reactions of all of the Overwatch Council officials in the courtyard. He watched the incomparably powerful and deeply rooted imperial power collide with Qin Pingping's lofty prestige in the Overwatch Council. The stretcher slowly moved. Under the rescue efforts of the imperial doctors, Qin Pingping, who had lost too much blood, managed to survive. The emperor did not allow him to die so easily and happily, so he could not die. Following the movement of the stretcher, the gazes of the Overwatch Council officials in the courtyard also moved. Their gazes were complicated, sorrowful, excited, hopeless, and angry. On the stretcher was the old man they all loved and respected. However, he could only lie dimly on the stretcher and prepare to welcome his wretched end the next day. Finally, someone could not resist crying out wretchedly and kneeled on the ground facing the stretcher. "Director! Old director!" All of the Overwatch Council officials knelt down. Although the edict had clearly stated that Director Qin was a heinous criminal who had tried to assassinate the emperor, they still could not resist kneeling down. Finally, someone could not resist. With a sharp cry, a few figures flew out from the crowd of Overwatch Council officials and headed straight for the stretcher. A few streaks of cold light sliced through the air. A few muffled thuds rang out. The air seemed to twist because of the vibrations. The autumn wind picked up and whistled through the air. When the dust settled, 4 Overwatch Council officials had been struck to the ground. The military aces who had attacked at the same time, as well as the internal court aces around Qin Pingping, all returned with their hands tied. Yan Bingyun watched this scene coldly. The corners of his eyes twitched slightly. He said, "Take them away. If there are any more rebellious actions, they will be dealt with according to the council's rules." Countless venomous and angry gazes turned toward Yan Bingyun at the same time. If looks could kill, Yan Bingyun's body would already be riddled with holes. However, his face was only slightly pale, and the lines on his sleeves did not move at all. He looked at his subordinates in the courtyard and said in a cold voice, "Remember your mission. Do you, officials of the Qin Kingdom, want to rebel?" At this moment, He Zongwei, who was standing beside him, suddenly said softly, "It's best to kill him on the spot to shock people. Since when is it your turn to talk when I do things?" Yan Bingyun threw out a sentence coldly. His words could make He Zongwei silent, but they could not make the officials of the Overwatch Council silent. They slowly rose and used a cold gaze to look at He Zongwei like they were looking at a dead person. Perhaps in the next moment, they would collectively attack and charge toward the stretcher. The situation in the Overwatch Council had reached a critical juncture. Yan Bingyun narrowed his eyes and looked around. He knew that he alone could not suppress these officials' love and respect for Qin Pingping. An old and wizened finger suddenly stretched out. Everyone fell silent. The gazes of all of the Overwatch Council officials turned toward the old finger, the finger that stretched out beside the stretcher. The finger changed slightly and made a gesture that all of the Overwatch Council officials remembered by heart. "Ho!" An official of the Second Bureau suddenly felt great sorrow in his heart. His eyes grew wet as he gave a loud roar of grief and anger. He then knelt down heavily on his knees. "Ho! Oh!" The old finger seemed to have some kind of magic. It only stretched out gently and shook. Immediately after, countless cries of "Ho!" rang out in the courtyard. Ho was silence. Ho was waiting. Ho was enduring silently. Ho was having no choice but to give up. Ho was staying where he was. All of the Overwatch Council officials stayed where they were. After the word "Ho" left their mouths, 2 lines of tears flowed down. Their knees were not heavy, but they were as heavy as mountains. They fell to the ground and watched as the stretcher slowly moved in front of the heavy person. All of the internal court aces, eunuchs, and military elites watched this scene with moved expressions. He Zongwei's face became deathly pale. Yan Bingyun's body swayed slightly. The dark fire of the Overwatch Council officials that could not be suppressed no matter what method they used was temporarily extinguished without any objection by the old finger. What kind of prestige? No, what kind of faith was this? Yan Bingyun's face was like ice. He knew that although the battle between the royal power and the old director had ended with the Overwatch Council being forced to submit, in reality, Director Chen had still won. The stretcher slowly moved in front of everyone and headed in the direction of the Overwatch Council's prison. He Zhongwei looked at this scene with a deathly pale face. Suddenly he saw the 4 captured Overwatch Council officials. He didn't know if he was trying to relax his state of mind or convince himself that the Overwatch Council was not that scary, but he unconsciously said in a quiet voice, "The Overwatch Council is indeed ordered as one. However, these people's strength is weaker than I imagined." Yan Bingyun turned to look at him coldly. After a slight pause, he said, "If it wasn't for the fact that I was shameless to this extent, if it wasn't for the fact that the old headmaster could still move a finger, I really can't imagine if the 2 of us would be able to leave this courtyard alive today." After saying this, he paid no more attention to He Zhongwei, who had his head lowered in thought. Following the stretcher and the guards sent by the palace, he walked desolately toward the Overwatch Council's prison. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.